Hey guys, tonight we are going to let our thoughts drift, like fine Saharan sand on a persistent breeze, towards a place that has shimmered in the imagination for centuries. You can almost see it now, can't you? A silhouette of distinctive, mud-built towers against a vast, star-dusted sky. The air thick with the scent of ancient dust, exotic spices, and something else, the almost tangible presence of knowledge, of stories waiting to be unsealed. We're journeying to Timbuktu, a name that for many just means the middle of nowhere, a synonym for the impossibly remote. And while it certainly was, and still is, a bit of a trek from your average suburban cul-de-sac, it was once a dazzling center of wealth, culture, and, most importantly for our sleepy exploration, incredible learning. Imagine trying to get there in its heyday, not with a GPS and a four-wheel drive, but by camel, for weeks, possibly months, across a landscape that views water as a delightful but very occasional rumor. You probably wouldn't survive the journey, let's be honest, especially if you forgot your really big sun hat. The sun out there doesn't do subtle. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, I'd love to see where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always a bit of a marvel to see this little community gather from all points of the compass. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel yourself settling, don't you? Your breathing slows, the day's little anxieties begin to unknot themselves, and your mind becomes receptive, ready to travel without moving an inch. Our destination tonight is not just a place on a map, but an idea, a legend whispered down through ages. Timbuktu. The very syllables have a musical, almost mythical quality. For centuries, in the Western world, it was a symbol of the ultimate exotic, the fabulously wealthy, and the tantalizingly inaccessible. It was the city of gold, the mysterious African El Dorado, a place you might hear about in hushed tones but could hardly picture. It wasn't exactly a weekend getaway spot, unless your idea of a spa day involved exfoliating with several tons of sand and a side of mild dehydration. Picture yourself at the edge of a truly immense ocean of sand, the Sahara Desert. It stretches out before you in every direction, waves of dunes sculpted by winds that have blown for millennia. It's a place that makes you feel very small, very insignificant, yet a place of profound, stark beauty. And there, nestled like a precious, perhaps slightly dusty jewel, near the great northern bend of the Niger River, is Timbuktu. Its location was no accident. It was strategically placed, a vital node where the desert met the river, where canoes laden with goods from the south could meet the camel caravans arriving from the north, laden with salt, a commodity once worth its weight in gold. And gold, of course, was the other part of Timbuktu's fame. The Mali Empire and later the Songhai Empire, of which Timbuktu was a key city, controlled some of the richest gold fields in West Africa. So, the mainstream historical fact we can tuck away tonight is that Timbuktu rose to prominence as a critical nexus for trans-Saharan trade, particularly in gold from the south and salt from the north, its geographical position fostering immense wealth and making it a magnet for merchants and scholars alike. But it wasn't just about the bling, though the gold definitely helped pay the bills and attract attention. What truly set Timbuktu apart, and what draws our sleepy curiosity tonight, was its reputation as a city of scholars, of books, of vast libraries filled with manuscripts. We're on a quest to unearth the stories of these lost libraries, to understand what secrets they held. And no, I'm not talking about the embarrassing internet search history kind of secrets, but actual parchment-bound wisdom, carefully copied by hand, discussing everything from the stars to the soul. The name Timbuktu itself is a bit of a historical puzzle. One popular origin story, a rather charming tidbit, suggests it means Buktu's well. Buktu, it said, was an old Tuareg woman, possibly with a particularly large navel according to some more colorful linguistic interpretations. Timbuktu, the lady with the big navel, though that's definitely up for debate, who was left to guard a campsite that eventually grew into the city. So, the legendary city might just be named after an old lady and her well. It's a wonderfully humble beginning for a place that would become so renowned. Historians still argue whether the earliest descriptions of Timbuktu by outsiders, which often painted it as an almost impossibly opulent city of learning, were exaggerated hearsay fueled by the desire for the exotic or tantalizingly accurate glimpses of a carefully guarded reality. Some early European maps basically had "Here be dragons" and maybe a university staffed by wizards, scribbled hopefully near where they thought Timbuktu might be, so keen were they to believe in its wonders. Imagine the intellectual ferment, the air buzzing not just with flies but with philosophical debate, with students reciting verses from the Quran, with astronomers charting the heavens using surprisingly sophisticated methods, all within buildings made of earth and wood, standing resilient against the encroaching desert. These weren't just dusty archives. They were living centers of thought, and their contents touched on every aspect of human endeavor. The idea that so much of this knowledge was hidden, lost, or threatened is what makes our journey tonight so compelling. We're not just digging through sand. We're sifting through the remnants of a vibrant intellectual world, trying to piece together what was known, what was valued, and what it all meant for the people who lived there, and perhaps even for us centuries later as we drift off to sleep. The whispers of those lost libraries are calling, promising a glimpse into a world both ancient and surprisingly relevant. The very air around you seems to grow warmer, drier, as we begin to approach the city's historical threshold. The warmth of that Saharan sun, even in our shared imagination, seems to intensify just a touch. You can almost feel the fine grit of sand settling, ever so lightly, on your skin as we step further back, beyond the golden haze of Timbuktu's peak, towards its very conception. Before the towering minarets, before the bustling marketplaces overflowing with salt, gold, and scholars, before even the first proper mud brick was laid with grand intention. This place was something far simpler, far more elemental. Imagine a landscape of undulating dunes, a seemingly endless expanse of ochre and tan, where the silence is broken only by the sigh of the wind or the distant cry of a desert bird. It's a challenging canvas upon which to build a dream, let alone a city. This was the domain of the Tuareg, the famed nomadic pastoralists of the Sahara, often called the Blue People, for the indigo dye of their traditional veils and clothing that would stain their skin. You see them, don't you? Tall, proud figures, masters of desert survival, moving with their herds of camels, goats, and sheep in a timeless rhythm dictated by the sparse resources of this arid world. For them, the patch of land that would become Timbuktu wasn't a future metropolis. It was a practical, life-sustaining convenience. Think of it as an extreme pop-up shop, but instead of artisanal cupcakes, it was, well, more sand and the promise of water. And in the desert, water is the ultimate five-star commodity. The primary mainstream historical fact to gently place into your drifting thoughts now is that Timbuktu was indeed initially established as a seasonal trading camp, likely around the 10th or 11th century, primarily by these Tuareg nomads. Its major draw? Proximity to the life-giving waters of the Niger River, especially during the seasons when other wells might run dry, and its position as a natural meeting point for different nomadic groups and, eventually, for traders coming from further afield. It was a place to replenish water skins, to graze animals, to barter for goods, before the vastness of the desert swallowed them again. It wasn't a city. It wasn't even really a village yet. It was a promise, a waypoint. You can picture those early encampments, can't you? Temporary shelters made of woven mats and animal skins, stretched over wooden frames, easily dismantled and carried on camelback. The smoke of small cooking fires spirals lazily into the clear desert air. The sounds are muted. The soft padding of camels, the murmur of Tamashek, the Tuareg language, the bleating of goats. At the heart of it all, as the legend from our last section suggested, was likely a well, perhaps the very well of Buktu. Finding a reliable well in the Sahara was like finding a forgotten $20 bill in an old coat pocket, only infinitely more life-sustaining and less likely to be spent on impulse-buy snacks. The well was the anchor, the reason to return season after season. Now, for a quirky little tidbit, while we often associate the Tuareg with this early settlement, the actual year-round guardianship of the site, particularly that crucial well, might have been entrusted to individuals or families of various origins, including possibly enslaved people or those of mixed heritage, who acted as caretakers when the main Tuareg groups moved on with their herds. So, the very first permanent residents might not have been the nomadic lords of the desert themselves, but rather the people who kept the welcome mat, or in this case, the well cover, out for them. Their TripAdvisor reviews, had such a thing existed, would have been very specific. Excellent well, 5 stars. Scorpions a bit much, 2 stars. Needs more shade options. One can only imagine the daily challenges and the incredible resilience required. The precise timeline of Timbuktu's transition from a strictly seasonal camp to a more permanent settlement is one of those delightfully fuzzy areas of history. Archaeologists and historians still argue whether permanent mud brick structures existed significantly earlier than the traditionally cited 10th or 11th century origins, based on scant but intriguing pottery shards and other subtle clues buried beneath the sand. It's like trying to read a story where most of the pages have been either erased by the wind or are still stubbornly hidden. Each new find, no matter how small, can shift our understanding of those very first footprints. You can feel the slow, almost imperceptible shift beginning to occur. What was once a temporary haven starts to hold a more lasting appeal. Perhaps a few families decide to stay year-round, seeing the potential in this spot. Maybe the trading activity becomes a little more regular, a little less dictated by the strictest seasonal migrations. The shelters become slightly more robust, the pathways between them a little more defined. The desert mirage is slowly, painstakingly, starting to solidify into something more tangible. The air is still dry, the sun still beats down, but there's a subtle change in the human energy of the place. It's the quiet hum of something beginning, the first tentative roots taking hold in the sandy soil, entirely unaware of the legendary status that awaits it centuries down the line. The idea of a library, of thousands of books, would have seemed as fantastical then as a spaceship landing beside the well. For now, survival, water, and trade are the scriptures of this nascent community. You feel that subtle shift, don't you? That quiet hum we left at the end of our last reflection is beginning to amplify, to pick up a more complex rhythm. The roots that were just tentatively taking hold in the sandy soil are now spreading, drawing sustenance from an ever-increasing flow of commerce and human interaction. The seasonal camp, the simple well stop, is starting to transform, almost like a time-lapse film, into something much more significant, something that begins to draw attention from distant corners of the known world. It's as if the desert itself, having guarded this spot for so long, has decided to reveal its potential. The key to this transformation, the lifeblood that pulsed through the nascent arteries of Timbuktu, was trade. And not just any trade, but the exchange of some of the most vital and sought-after commodities of the medieval world. The first of these, and perhaps the most dazzling to the outside imagination, was gold. You can almost see it, can't you? Not as coins, necessarily, in these early stages, but as dust, as nuggets, carried in pouches and bags from the rich gold fields of Bambuk and Bure, far to the south and west. This wasn't just pocket money. This was the stuff of legends, the foundation of empires. It flowed northwards, towards the Mediterranean world and Europe, and Timbuktu was becoming a crucial funnel for this glittering stream. But gold, for all its allure, needs a dance partner in the world of trade. And in the Sahara, that partner was salt. Now, for us, salt is something so common we barely think about it. A cheap seasoning you might spill and then casually toss over your shoulder for good luck. But in West Africa, south of the Sahara where salt deposits were scarce, it was an absolute necessity for preserving food, for health, for livestock. And the great salt mines, like Tagaza in the heart of the desert, were the source. Imagine seasoning your chips with something that cost as much as your jewelry. Suddenly, a dash of salt becomes a major financial decision. This makes the mainstream historical fact for this section quite central. Timbuktu's strategic location at the confluence of desert and riverine trade routes catapulted it into a crucial trans-Saharan emporium where Saharan salt from the north was systematically exchanged for West African gold from the south, forming the backbone of its burgeoning economy. You can picture the caravans, can't you? These weren't your quick Amazon Prime deliveries. A trans-Saharan caravan was a months-long commitment, basically a really slow, sandy, and incredibly high-stakes road trip. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, of camels laden with massive blocks of salt, hewn from places so desolate they made Timbuktu look like a tropical paradise. As a quirky, or rather grim, tidbit. The salt mining center of Tagaza was so devoid of other building materials that even the houses of the miners, many of whom were enslaved individuals forced to endure horrific conditions, were constructed from blocks of salt. Living in a salt house in a salt mine to dig up more salt. It's a level of irony the desert seems to specialize in. These caravans, arriving like slow-moving ships from an ocean of sand, brought not just salt, but also dates, horses, copper, cloth, and manufactured goods from North Africa, the Middle East, and even Europe. And in return, heading back north from Timbuktu, went the gold, along with cola nuts, the original pick-me-up, long before your fancy energy drinks, ivory, grains, and tragically, enslaved people captured in regional conflicts or raids. The marketplace in Timbuktu must have been an extraordinary spectacle of sights, sounds, and smells. You can almost hear the early market cries. Got your gold here. Fresh salt. Just in from the north. Slightly used camel. One careful owner. Only occasionally spits. The babble of languages. Tamashek, Songhai, Berber dialects, Arabic would have created a constant, vibrant hum. Now, with all this wealth flowing in and out, with all these different people meeting and interacting, something else began to happen. Timbuktu started to attract not just those seeking material riches, but also those seeking knowledge, or those who could offer it. Merchants needed literate individuals to keep records, to draw up contracts. The growing Islamic faith, which was taking root in the region, more on that soon, I promise, required scholars to interpret the Quran to teach Islamic law. And so, alongside the gold dust and the salt blocks, you begin to see the first trickles of what would become a flood of intellectual capital. Wise men, judges, clerics, and teachers started to see Timbuktu as a place of opportunity, a place where their skills were valued and where they could engage with a cosmopolitan community. Economic historians still argue whether the economic prosperity of Timbuktu was primarily driven by this famous gold-salt exchange, which certainly has the most legendary ring to it, or if the trade in enslaved peoples and other diverse commodities like cola nuts and textiles played an equally, if regrettably, significant role in its early accumulation of wealth and its ability to support a scholarly class. It's a complex tapestry, and the threads of commerce and human suffering are often uncomfortably intertwined in the making of great cities. But for now, feel the pulse of this blossoming town. The sun beats down, yes, but there's a new energy in the air. The temporary shelters are giving way to more permanent mud brick structures. The pathways are becoming streets. The well of Buktu is no longer just a lonely watering hole, but the heart of a thriving, dynamic community. Its reputation beginning to whisper across the sands, carried on the winds of trade, drawing the world, bit by bit, to its dusty, promising doorstep. The foundations for those famous libraries are being laid, not yet with bricks and mortar, but with every transaction, every conversation, every new arrival bringing their own piece of the world. That vibrant hum of Timbuktu's marketplace, the clatter of commerce and the murmur of diverse tongues we were just imagining, begins to harmonize with a new, profound melody. As goods and people flowed into this burgeoning city, so too did ideas, beliefs, and a faith that would irrevocably shape its destiny and pave the way for those legendary libraries. You can almost sense a shift in the spiritual atmosphere, a new layer of contemplation settling over the practicalities of daily trade. This is the arrival of Islam, not as a conquering force in these early days, but as a persuasive presence, carried in the hearts and minds of merchants and scholars traveling with the salt and gold caravans from North Africa. The mainstream historical fact to gently cradle in your thoughts now is that Islam was introduced to West Africa, including the region that would nurture Timbuktu, primarily through Amazigh or Berber traders and scholars, beginning as early as the 8th and 9th centuries. Its adoption, particularly by local rulers and the urban elite, was often gradual but profoundly impactful, because it brought with it the Arabic script and a deep reverence for the written word, most centrally, the Quran. Suddenly, knowing your Aleph from your Ba wasn't just good for showing off at parties, it was key to understanding the divine, and also, not getting fleeced in a trade deal written in particularly fine Arabic print. Imagine those first Islamic scholars and traders arriving. They weren't just bringing dates and cloth. They were bringing a sophisticated legal system, a rich theological tradition, and a language that was the lingua franca of scholarship across a vast swathe of the known world, from Spain to Persia. For a city like Timbuktu, eager to engage with this wider world, embracing Islam, or at least elements of it, offered significant advantages. Learning to read and write Arabic for the first time must have been like trying to assemble IKEA furniture with instructions written in ancient alien. Incredibly rewarding once you figured it out, but a real head-scratcher at the start for those accustomed only to oral traditions. This new faith placed an enormous emphasis on knowledge, ilm in Arabic, and the act of seeking it. The Quran itself, as the literal word of God, was the ultimate text, and its study was a sacred duty. This naturally led to the establishment of schools or madrasas, often connected to the first simple mosques, where students would learn to read, write, and memorize passages from the Holy Book. You can picture small groups of students gathered around a teacher, perhaps in the shade of an acacia tree or within a simple mud brick enclosure, painstakingly tracing Arabic letters on wooden boards, their voices chanting verses that had traveled thousands of miles. These were the first seeds of Timbuktu's scholarly gardens. Now for a fascinating, quirky tidbit about this period of religious transformation. The initial adoption of Islam in many parts of West Africa, Timbuktu included, was often a wonderfully syncretic process. This means it wasn't always a case of out with the old, in with the new. Instead, existing local animist beliefs, traditions, and spiritual practices often coexisted, and sometimes beautifully, sometimes a bit awkwardly, blended with Islamic tenets for a considerable time. It was a bit like adding new, exotic spices to a beloved family recipe. The old familiar flavors were still there, offering comfort and continuity, but now with an intriguing new kick that made everyone pay attention and perhaps reconsider the whole dish. So, while the call to prayer might be heard, older rituals connected to the river, the harvest, or ancestral spirits might still have held sway in daily life. This gradual blending and the motivations behind the embrace of Islam by the ruling classes lead us to an ongoing discussion. Historians still argue whether the initial impetus for the embrace of Islam by West African rulers was primarily driven by genuine spiritual conviction and a desire for divine truth, or by the significant diplomatic, legal, and commercial advantages that came with being part of the Dar al-Islam, the vast, interconnected Islamic world. Being able to correspond in Arabic with potentates in Cairo or Fez, or to use Islamic commercial law in dealings with North African merchants, certainly didn't hurt one's political or economic standing. Perhaps, as with many major life decisions, it was a complex mix of both faith and pragmatism. But whatever the precise motivations, the impact was undeniable. The presence of a shared faith and a common scholarly language began to attract more and more learned individuals. These weren't just traders who happened to be Muslim. These were dedicated qadis, judges, imams, prayer leaders, and ulama, scholars, who saw Timbuktu as a fertile ground for their work. They brought books with them, copies of the Quran, commentaries, legal texts, works of grammar and poetry. And where there are books and people who value them, the need to copy them, study them, and store them naturally arises. The folios in our section's guiding thought, those precious handwritten volumes, are beginning to accumulate, to become a defining feature of the city's identity. You can feel Timbuktu evolving, can't you? It's no longer just a place where you swap salt for gold. It's becoming a place where you swap ignorance for enlightenment. A place where the rustle of parchment and the thoughtful stroke of a reed pen are becoming as familiar as the braying of camels. The spiritual and intellectual landscape is being irrigated by this new faith, and the seeds of great libraries are finding incredibly fertile soil, preparing for a remarkable bloom that will soon capture the awe of distant lands. The journey of a simple belief system, carried across an immense desert, is now laying down the very bedrock for a city of legendary learning. That fertile soil we spoke of, where the seeds of learning and faith were taking root in Timbuktu, was part of a much larger, incredibly powerful entity, the Mali Empire. And as Timbuktu blossomed under its wing, the empire itself was about to get a dose of international publicity so potent, so dazzling, it would etch its name, and by extension Timbuktu's, into the consciousness of the wider medieval world. This wasn't a carefully crafted PR campaign involving influencers and hashtags. This was a pilgrimage, but a pilgrimage on such an epic scale of opulence that it still echoes through the annals of history. You can almost feel the ground begin to tremble with the approach of an immense procession. At the heart of this extraordinary event is one man, Mansa Musa I, the Emperor, or Mansa, of Mali. Before we delve into his legendary journey, here's a rather curious tidbit about how he might have come to power. It's said by some sources that his predecessor, possibly a figure named Mansa Abubakari II, wasn't overthrown or anything so dramatic. Instead, this earlier Mansa was apparently so intrigued by the idea of what lay beyond the vast Atlantic Ocean that he equipped a huge fleet of ships, some say hundreds, and sailed off westwards, never to be seen again. So, while Mansa Musa was perhaps contemplating more terrestrial matters, his predecessor was apparently auditioning for the role of first guy to get spectacularly lost at sea looking for another continent. Different career paths, I suppose. It's one of those historical whispers that is fascinating but fiercely debated and certainly not mainstream accepted history as pre-Columbian contact. But it does make for a rather dramatic vacancy on the throne for someone like Musa to fill. And fill it he did with style. The mainstream historical fact that absolutely glitters from this era is Mansa Musa's Hajj, his pilgrimage to Mecca, which he undertook in 1324 and 1325. This wasn't just a pious trip. It was a colossal spectacle of Mali's immense wealth and power. Imagine a caravan stretching for miles, a moving city snaking its way across the Sahara and towards Egypt. Accounts, though they vary, speak of tens of thousands of soldiers, attendants, and enslaved people, and most famously, camels, hundreds of them, perhaps even thousands each reportedly laden with sacks of pure gold dust. It was less a pilgrimage and more like history's most epic Make It Rain tour, but with a deeply spiritual purpose, of course. When this golden river of humanity reached Cairo, the effect was astounding. Mansa Musa, a devout Muslim, was also incredibly generous, or perhaps, incredibly keen to show the sophistication and buying power of his empire. He spent and gave away so much gold in Cairo on alms, in the markets, as gifts to dignitaries, that he single-handedly, if inadvertently, caused massive inflation. The value of gold in Cairo plummeted and, according to some Arab historians, didn't fully recover for over a decade. Imagine being so rich you accidentally break the economy of a major city just by doing your souvenir shopping. Oops, did I do that? Mansa Musa probably didn't say, being a dignified emperor and all, but the economic shockwave was real. This lavish display, while perhaps causing a headache for Egyptian currency speculators, did something remarkable for Mali's international profile. Suddenly, this sub-Saharan empire was not just a vague notion but a very real, very wealthy player on the world stage. News of Mansa Musa's golden Hajj spread like wildfire through the trade routes, reaching Europe. Not long after, European mapmakers, like Abraham Cresques, who created the Catalan Atlas in 1375, began to depict the Mansa of Mali seated on a throne, holding a golden orb or nugget, a clear testament to his renowned wealth. Timbuktu, as one of the principal cities of this fabulously rich empire, and already gaining a name for its trade and early scholarship, basked in this reflected glory. Now, the motivations behind such an extravagant display are, naturally, something scholars love to ponder. Historians still argue whether Mansa Musa's legendary distribution of gold was a calculated act of statecraft designed to boost Mali's international prestige, attract skilled artisans and scholars, and encourage foreign investment, or if it was primarily a perhaps naive but deeply felt expression of piety and royal generosity that inadvertently disrupted regional economies. Was he a savvy geopolitical marketer or just an incredibly open-handed pilgrim who maybe didn't fully grasp the concept of supply and demand on that scale? The truth, as always, is likely a complex blend. What is certain is that on his return journey from Mecca, Mansa Musa brought back with him not just renewed spiritual fervor, but also scholars, architects, and books from the wider Islamic world. He was particularly taken with Andalusian architecture and is credited with commissioning men like Asahili, a poet and architect from Granada, to build new, grander mosques and palaces in Mali, including in Timbuktu itself. This is when structures like the famous Jingareber Mosque began to take on a more monumental form. So, this single, astonishing pilgrimage didn't just empty Mali's treasuries for a bit. It refilled its intellectual and cultural reservoirs. The fame it generated acted like a powerful magnet, drawing even more merchants seeking fortunes and, crucially for our story, more scholars and students seeking knowledge to cities like Timbuktu. The city was no longer just a regional hub. It was becoming an international destination, a place whose name was whispered with awe in the courts and marketplaces of Africa, Europe, and the Middle East, all thanks to an emperor who knew how to make an entrance and an exit with a truly golden touch. The stage was now set for an even greater flourishing of learning within Timbuktu's sandy embrace. That golden touch of Mansa Musa, which so spectacularly advertised Mali's wealth to the world, also carried a deep desire to cultivate the spiritual and intellectual landscape back home. As he returned from his Hajj, his mind brimming with the wonders he'd seen in Cairo and Mecca, he wasn't just thinking about gold reserves. He was thinking about edifices, about creating lasting monuments to faith and learning in his empire. And Timbuktu, already a rising star, was a prime beneficiary of this imperial vision. You can almost feel the anticipation in the city, a sense of something grand about to take shape from the very earth itself. This is where we see the magnificent university mosques of Timbuktu begin to truly rise, not just as places of prayer, but as the vibrant hearts of an expansive intellectual network. Forget manicured quadrangles and ivy-covered halls. This was a university system woven into the very fabric of the city's spiritual life, centered around its most sacred spaces. The three great pillars of this system, names that resonate with the history of African scholarship, are the mosques of Jingareber, Sankor, and Sidi Yahya. Let's start with Jingareber, often spelled a dozen different ways, just to keep you on your toes. Its construction, or perhaps a major reconstruction and expansion, is the mainstream historical fact we'll lay down here. It was commissioned by Mansa Musa himself around 1327. Tradition holds that he employed the talents of one Abu Ishaq Yesaheli, that poet and architect we mentioned he persuaded to return with him from Granada in its design. Yesaheli is often credited with introducing the fired brick technique and a more distinct Sudano-Sahelian architectural style, characterized by its imposing adobe structures, timber beam supports, and tapering minarets. Imagine Mansa Musa, fresh from seeing the grand mosques of the Middle East, wanting something equally impressive, yet uniquely Malian, to grace his city. Picture the Jingareber Mosque, a vast, sprawling structure of mud brick, its walls thick and imposing, offering a cool respite from the Saharan sun. Its most distinctive feature is often its minaret, a sturdy, pyramidal tower from which the muezzin's call to prayer would echo across the city. Building with mud in a place that occasionally gets actual rain and endures blistering heat might sound like a special kind of optimistic engineering. You might think it's like making a chocolate teapot and hoping for a cool day. But this wasn't just any mud. It was bonko, a carefully prepared mix of clay, straw, rice husks, and cow dung. Yes, really, it's a fantastic binder, which, when dried, creates incredibly durable, thick walls that are excellent insulators. Then there's the Sankor Mosque, which evolved into perhaps the most famous component of what's often loosely termed the University of Sankor. While its precise origins might be a bit earlier, it was during this period, from the 14th century onwards, that it truly flourished. It wasn't a single building with a registrar's office and a student union, but rather a collection of largely independent schools and teachers, each associated with the mosque. Its courtyard would have been a hub of scholarly activity, with students and masters engaged in discussion and study. And finally, the Sidi Yahya Mosque, named after a revered saint. A rather charming, if perhaps apocryphal, tidbit surrounds its founding. It's said that a part of the mosque, or the site for it, was prepared around 1400 by a local governor in anticipation of a holy man who was yet to arrive. He built it, so the story goes, awaiting a great saint who would eventually come from the east. That saint was supposedly Sidi Yahya al-Tadalsi, who arrived some 40 years later to become its first imam and chief scholar. Imagine building a massive part of your university complex and being like, alright, this section is for a VIP who hasn't RSVP'd yet, but we're pretty sure he'll show up eventually, probably in a few decades. Talk about faith in your long-term recruitment strategy. These mosques, while unique, share that distinctive Sudano-Sahelian architectural style. You see the exposed wooden beams, or torin, jutting out from the walls, which are not just decorative but also serve as ready-made scaffolding for the annual replastering. This replastering, by the way, isn't just routine maintenance. It's often a major community festival, a collective effort involving specialized guilds of masons and the entire populace. It's the ultimate team-building exercise. Forget trust falls. Try not to drop the guy handing you a fresh bucket of bonko from a swaying, rickety scaffold, all while keeping the lines of the mosque perfectly true. The visual impact of these structures is profound. They seem to grow organically from the earth itself, their lines softened by the hand plastering, their colors shifting with the light from pale tan to deep ochre. Inside, you'd find vast prayer halls, the roofs supported by rows of thick earthen pillars, creating a cool, dim, and sacred space. Light would filter in through small, strategically placed openings, illuminating floating dust motes and earnest faces bent over precious texts. Now, the exact architectural lineage always sparks a good discussion. Architectural historians still argue whether the primary inspiration for the striking Sudano-Sahelian style of Timbuktu's mosques was predominantly indigenous West African building traditions, which had long used earth for construction, simply adapted and scaled up for Islamic worship, or if it was more heavily influenced by North African and Middle Eastern mosque designs and building techniques brought south along the trade routes and by pilgrims like Mansa Musa and architects like Es Saheli. It's likely a fusion, a creative dialogue between local ingenuity and imported ideas, resulting in something truly unique to this region. These three great mosques, Jingareber, Sankor, and Sidi Yahya, became the anchors of Timbuktu's intellectual life. They were more than just places of prayer. They were libraries, lecture halls, debating societies, and sanctuaries for scholars. Their earthen walls would soon echo with the rustle of countless folios and the quiet murmur of profound learning. As Timbuktu solidified its claim as a true city of wisdom, the physical framework for an extraordinary flourishing of knowledge was now firmly in place, ready to be filled. Those magnificent earthen structures we were just picturing, Jingareber, Sidi Yahya, and particularly Sankor, were far more than just beautiful examples of Sudano-Sahelian architecture. They were the crucibles within which Timbuktu's legendary scholarly tradition was forged. Let your mind now settle specifically around the Sankor Mosque, or rather, the intellectual ecosystem that blossomed in its shade, often referred to as the University of Sankor. The term university might conjure images of a central administration, a formal admissions office, and perhaps a slightly underwhelming student cafeteria, but Sankor operated on a wonderfully different, more organic model. The primary mainstream historical fact to absorb as you drift deeper is that the University of Sankor wasn't a monolithic, centralized institution like Oxford or the Sorbonne of the same era. Instead, it was a highly decentralized collective of numerous independent scholars and their individual schools or circles, madrasas or halqas. Each master or sheikh would have his own students, sometimes teaching in a quiet corner of the Sankor Mosque's expansive courtyard, sometimes in his own home, or in dedicated study rooms. Think of it less like a stuffy, bureaucratic university with department heads and parking permits, and more like a really intense, scholarly Coachella, with different stages where an amazing scholar would be performing their exegesis or leading a debate, and you, as an earnest student, just wandered to whichever lecture tent or discussion circle truly captivated your interest and matched your level of study. A student arriving in Timbuktu with a thirst for knowledge wouldn't enroll with a registrar. They would seek out a particular scholar known for their expertise in a specific field. The relationship was deeply personal, built on respect and a shared commitment to learning. Students would often live with their masters or in nearby lodgings, becoming part of an intimate scholarly family. The education itself was structured in progressing levels or circles. It typically began, as you might expect in such a devoutly Islamic environment, with the complete memorization and understanding of the Quran. This alone was a monumental undertaking, requiring years of dedication. Imagine your final exam for your first degree being to recite an entire sacred scripture, perfectly from memory, complete with the nuanced rules of its recitation. Makes that multiple-choice test you once crammed for seem like a gentle suggestion, doesn't it? Once the Quran was mastered, students would move on to Islamic theology, tawhid, jurisprudence, and law fiqh, often of the Maliki school which was prevalent in West Africa. The traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, hadith, Arabic grammar, nahw, and linguistics, rhetoric, and logic. These were the foundational subjects, equipping students with the tools for critical thought and religious understanding. For those who progressed further, the curriculum could broaden considerably. They might delve into mathematics, astronomy, essential for determining prayer times and the direction of Mecca, history, geography, ethics, political science, and even aspects of medicine as it was understood then, often drawing from classical Greek texts preserved and expanded upon by Islamic scholars. The method of teaching was rigorous and largely oral, though texts were, of course, central. A master would often dictate from a renowned work, explaining passages, answering questions, and engaging students in lively debate. Students would meticulously copy these texts for their own study, creating their own personal libraries, those precious, sacred scrolls that are the focus of our journey. This act of copying was itself a profound learning experience, embedding the knowledge deep within the student's mind. Memorization, as we've touched upon, played an enormous role. A truly quirky and impressive tidbit is the sheer volume of texts some scholars reportedly committed to memory. We hear of individuals who knew not just the Quran, but thousands of hadith, vast legal treatises, and lengthy poems by heart. It was a world where your mind was your primary hard drive, and its storage capacity was legendary. Upon completion of a comprehensive course of study with one or more masters, a student didn't receive a printed certificate in a fancy folder. Instead, the highest recognition, akin to a doctorate and a license to teach, ijaza, was often symbolized by the public presentation of a turban imama by their master. This wasn't just any hat. It was a mark of scholarly attainment, a visible sign that the recipient was now considered a qualified scholar, ready to teach others and contribute to the intellectual life of the community. Forget a framed diploma you hang on the wall to impress your parents. These guys got a really distinguished hat, much more practical for keeping the sun off in the Sahara. 2. I'd imagine. Now, as with any historical reconstruction of an educational system so different from our own, there are points of ongoing discussion. Educational historians still argue whether the curriculum at Sankor was as consistently broad and encompassing of the secular sciences, like advanced mathematics, detailed astronomy, or practical medicine, for a large number of students as some of the more glowing historical accounts suggest, or if the primary, overwhelming focus for most remained squarely on Islamic theology, law, and Arabic linguistics, with these other fascinating subjects being pursued more intensively by only a select, specialized few. It's a question of emphasis and the typical student experience versus the exceptional one. What is clear is that Sankor, and Timbuktu as a whole, fostered an environment of profound intellectual vibrancy. The pursuit of knowledge was seen as a sacred duty and a path to wisdom. The sands around the Sankor Mosque were not just absorbing the heat of the sun, but also the intellectual energy of generations of scholars and students, all dedicated to understanding their world and their place within it, through the careful study and preservation of those precious, handwritten scrolls. The air itself must have hummed with recitation, debate, and the quiet scratch of reed pens on parchment. That vibrant hum of intellectual endeavor we felt around the Sankor Mosque, the earnest debates and the dedicated memorization, all revolved around one absolutely essential tool, the book, the handwritten manuscript. Those sacred scrolls weren't just passive objects of study. They were the lifeblood of Timbuktu's scholarly world, and their creation, acquisition, and preservation formed a crucial industry, a testament to how deeply this city valued knowledge. You can almost smell the faint, dry scent of old paper and a particular kind of ink in the air as we delve into this world of folios and fonts. The most central historical fact to absorb now is that Timbuktu hosted a remarkably sophisticated and thriving book trade. Manuscripts were meticulously, painstakingly copied by hand by armies of skilled scribes, or Nasakin. These weren't just any old books. They were often imported from across the Sahara, from Cairo, Fez, Damascus, Baghdad, even Andalusia, representing centuries of Islamic scholarship. And because of the effort involved in their creation and transportation, these books were highly valued commodities. It's famously said that in Timbuktu, books were often considered more precious than gold or any other trade good. Imagine going shopping and having to choose between a new luxury camel, perhaps a top-of-the-line Mahari racing model, or the latest commentary on Aristotle. Tough call for some, perhaps, but in Timbuktu, the book probably won a significant portion of the time. Camels are undoubtedly great for getting around the desert, but can they explain the finer points of Avicenna's metaphysics or the intricacies of Maliki law? Let's picture the scene. The paper itself was often a luxury import, typically from North Africa or even Europe via the trans-Saharan routes, though some local production might have existed. It would have been rag paper, made from linen or cotton fibers, more durable than the wood pulp paper we're used to today. Then there was the ink. Scribes in Timbuktu were masters of ink making, often using closely guarded family recipes. Common ingredients included gum arabic, from local acacia trees, soot, for black ink, and various plant extracts or minerals for different colors, though black and sometimes a reddish brown were most common for the main text. Their pens wouldn't be fancy fountain pens, but callums, carefully shaped reed pens, cut to a precise nib. And the scribes themselves? These were highly respected artisans and scholars in their own right. Being a scribe was like being a human photocopier, but with infinitely better handwriting, an artistic sensibility, and a serious risk of permanent ink stains that just wouldn't come out with a bit of soap and water. There was no undo button for mistakes, no delete key. An error meant careful scraping of the ink from the parchment or paper with a special knife, or sometimes, if the error was too great, having to discard the entire expensive sheet and start over. Their work required immense concentration, patience, and a deep knowledge of Arabic calligraphy, often in various regional styles like Maghribi script. They weren't just copying words. They were preserving knowledge, ensuring its transmission across generations. You can imagine them, perhaps working in a quiet courtyard. The only sounds the rhythmic scratch of their pens and the rustle of pages. This reverence for books fueled a significant economy. Wealthy scholars, merchants, and rulers in Timbuktu prided themselves on their extensive private libraries. Collecting books was a mark of status, piety, and intellectual refinement. Scholars would commission scribes to copy rare texts, or they would purchase manuscripts brought by traveling merchants. Prices could be astronomical. A single, beautifully copied manuscript of a major work could cost as much as a house or several enslaved people. This wasn't just about conspicuous consumption. It was about possessing and providing access to knowledge. These private libraries often became informal centers of learning themselves, with their owners making their collections available to students and fellow scholars. Here's a quirky little tidbit that speaks volumes about how precious these manuscripts were. Scribes, and sometimes the owners of the books, would occasionally add personal notes, prayers, or even curses in the colophon. That's the inscription at the end of a manuscript which often gives details about its copying. These curses were aimed at anyone who might steal the book, damage it, or even, sometimes, lend it out and not get it back promptly. It's the medieval equivalent of writing, "This book is the property of Sheikh Al-Mamun," followed by something like, "And if you dare to filch it, may your favorite camel get incurable mange and your couscous always be lumpy and taste of despair." Very effective, I'm sure, or at least a strong deterrent. Now, the extent to which this book culture permeated Timbuktu society is a topic of gentle scholarly discussion. Social historians still argue whether access to books and functional literacy was relatively widespread among Timbuktu's broader merchant and artisan classes, or if high-level scholarship and the ownership of extensive private libraries remained almost exclusively the domain of a small, elite group of renowned scholarly families and a few exceptionally wealthy patrons. Was every other person on the street carrying a well-thumbed volume of poetry, or was the deep engagement with these texts confined to a more rarefied circle? The truth likely lies somewhere in between, with varying degrees of literacy and access. But what's undeniable is that ink, paper, and power were inextricably linked in Timbuktu. The power wasn't just political or economic. It was the power of knowledge, the power of interpretation, the power of possessing and understanding the sacred and scholarly texts that defined their world. The city's reputation wasn't just built on the gold that passed through it, but on the far more valuable intellectual currency it generated and hoarded within the calfskin or goatskin bindings of its countless manuscripts. Each folio, each carefully penned line, was a testament to a society that had placed learning at its very core, creating a legacy written in indelible ink. That precious ink and paper we were just imagining, the carefully copied manuscripts that were more valuable than gold, weren't just filled with random jottings or idle thoughts. Oh no, the vast majority of these treasured texts in Timbuktu's libraries, the very heart of its scholarly power, delved deep into the core of Islamic religious sciences. This was the bedrock of their intellectual world, the subjects that scholars and students would dedicate their entire lives to mastering. So, let's gently pull back the covers of these ancient folios and peek at the kind of divine deep dives that captivated the minds of Timbuktu. At the absolute, unshakable center of it all, of course, was the Holy Quran itself. You can feel the reverence, can't you? Not just a book, but considered the literal word of God, revealed to the Prophet Muhammad. The study was paramount. But this wasn't just about reading the words. It involved a whole constellation of disciplines. There was tajwid, the meticulous science of perfect Quranic recitation, ensuring every syllable, every vowel, every pause was pronounced exactly as it should be, preserving the sacred sound of the revelation. Then there was tafsir, the profound art and science of Quranic exegesis or commentary. Scholars would spend lifetimes exploring the meanings, contexts, and interpretations of its verses, trying to understand all the layers of meaning in the Quran through these voluminous commentaries, often drawing upon generations of previous scholarship, was like trying to peel an infinite onion, but instead of tears, you got profound spiritual insights. And occasionally, you also got a really good, really intense debate with your study buddy over a particularly nuanced point. Following closely in importance were the hadith, the recorded sayings, actions, and approvals of the Prophet Muhammad. These traditions served as a vital source of guidance on how to live a life in accordance with Islamic principles, complementing the Quran. Collections of hadith, like those by Sahih al-Bukhari or Sahih Muslim, were meticulously studied, authenticated, and memorized. Imagine sifting through thousands of these short narratives, each a little window into the Prophet's life, trying to discern the authentic from the less reliable, and then applying these teachings to your own existence. It was a monumental task of memory and critical analysis. Now, if the Quran and Hadith provided the foundational sources, then fiqh or Islamic jurisprudence was the discipline that systematically derived practical laws and ethical guidelines from them. This is where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, or perhaps where the camel meets the caravan route. The mainstream historical fact to gently absorb here is that the core of Timbuktu's scholarly output and its manuscript collections was overwhelmingly centered on these Islamic religious sciences, particularly Quranic exegesis, tafsir, hadith studies, and fiqh, with the Maliki school of law being the dominant legal tradition throughout West Africa, including Timbuktu. The Maliki school, founded by Imam Malik ibn Anas in Medina, is one of the four major Sunni schools of law, and it became deeply entrenched in this region. You can picture scholars in Timbuktu poring over seminal Maliki texts like the Muwatta of Imam Malik or the Risala of Ibn Abi Zayd al-Qayrawani, debating legal points that could affect everything from commercial contracts and inheritance to marriage, criminal justice, and even the proper conduct of prayer. Imagine having a detailed rulebook and centuries of scholarly opinion for literally everything, from the most sacred rituals to how you should divide inheritance if your uncle's prized camel unfortunately wanders off during a sandstorm and joins a Tuareg boy band that refuses to give it back. The Maliki school, as interpreted by Timbuktu scholars, likely had a thoughtful legal precedent or at least a methodology to approach it. Then there was Tawhid, Islamic theology or doctrine, which focuses on the oneness and unity of God. This involved deep philosophical inquiry into the nature of God, divine attributes, prophethood, and the afterlife. Texts on Tawhid would explore complex theological questions, often engaging with different schools of thought within Islam. It was about understanding the very essence of faith, the intellectual foundations upon which everything else was built. A quirky and fascinating tidbit about the intensity of the scholarship is the phenomenon of supercommentaries, or even super commentaries. A renowned scholar might write an extensive commentary on a core text, say a major work of fiqh. Then, a generation or two later, another equally brilliant scholar might write a commentary on that commentary, clarifying its points, debating its conclusions, or adding new insights. And sometimes, it didn't even stop there. It's like academics today writing lengthy reviews of other academics' reviews of seminal books. Some intellectual habits, it seems, transcend time, just the font and the likelihood of it being a PDF instead of handwritten parchment change. This layering shows an incredible depth of engagement and a continuous scholarly conversation unfolding across centuries. Of course, with such a deep legal tradition, questions arise about its application. Islamic legal historians still argue whether the application of Maliki jurisprudence in Timbuktu was consistently rigid and strictly text-bound, adhering only to the letter of established commentaries, or if local qadis, judges, and muftis, legal consultants, demonstrated significant flexibility and intellectual dynamism in adapting Islamic law to the unique Saharan socio-economic conditions, local customs, urf, and the challenges of a diverse, cosmopolitan trading hub. How did they balance the weight of tradition with the practical needs of their community? These religious sciences, tafsir, hadith, fiqh, tawhid, were not pursued as dry, abstract academic exercises. They were seen as vital for individual salvation, for the proper ordering of society, and for maintaining justice and morality. The knowledge contained within these folios was considered sacred, powerful, and profoundly relevant to every aspect of life in Timbuktu. This deep dive into divine law and theology formed the unshakable foundation upon which all other forms of knowledge in the city were built and understood. And it's from this solid bedrock that we'll see other intellectual branches begin to sprout. That deep, resonant foundation of divine law and theology we just explored, the very bedrock of Timbuktu's intellectual life, was incredibly robust. But it wasn't the only stratum of knowledge being carefully cultivated within those sandy confines. While the religious sciences undoubtedly held pride of place, the scholars of Timbuktu also cast their gaze outwards to the stars, inwards to the logic of numbers, and towards the very practical matter of healing the human body. You might be surprised by the sophisticated understanding of these scientific pursuits that existed alongside the intensive study of sacred texts. So, let's gently adjust our focus now from the purely divine to the intriguingly empirical. First, let's look up at the night sky, just as the scholars of Timbuktu would have done. Astronomy, or ilm al-falak, was a keenly studied subject, not just out of idle curiosity about those twinkling celestial bodies, but for intensely practical religious reasons. Figuring out the precise times for the 5 daily prayers, determining the Qibla, the exact direction of Mecca towards which Muslims pray, and establishing the Islamic lunar calendar, which governs fasting during Ramadan and the timing of the Hajj pilgrimage, all required accurate astronomical knowledge. Imagine trying to orient yourself for prayer in the vast, featureless expanse of the Sahara, or timing a crucial religious festival based on the sighting of a new moon. It's like using a highly advanced celestial GPS, but your smartphone is the entire night sky, and there's definitely no friendly voice saying, recalculating route, if you happen to misinterpret a constellation. The scholars would have used astronomical tables, known as zij, often inherited and adapted from earlier Islamic astronomers in places like Baghdad or Cordoba, to make their calculations. Then there were the sums, the mathematics, or ilm al-hizb. This wasn't just about abstract number theory for the fun of it, though some scholars certainly appreciated its elegance. Mathematics was an essential tool for everyday life and for the functioning of the Islamic legal system. Think about the bustling trade we discussed earlier. Merchants needed arithmetic for their accounts, for currency exchange, for calculating profits and losses. And remember those complex Maliki inheritance laws? Dividing up an estate according to these rules, which often involved intricate fractions and specific shares for various relatives, probably made many people wish they'd paid a bit more attention in their mathematics lessons. Okay, so the third cousin twice removed, who only shows up for weddings and funerals, gets 1/24 of a camel. Presumably the front bit, if we're being generous. Geometry was also important, not just for land surveying, but also for the beautiful geometric patterns you see in Islamic art and architecture, which often adorned mosques and public buildings. And what about when the body ailed? This brings us to the salves, to medicine, or ilm al-tib. The mainstream historical fact to gently place in your mind here is that scholars and practitioners in Timbuktu engaged with a rich medical tradition that blended classical Greco-Arabic knowledge, texts from Hippocrates, Galen, and especially Avicenna, Ibn Sina, whose canon of medicine was a cornerstone of medical study across the Islamic world for centuries, with extensive local West African ethnobotanical wisdom. They studied anatomy, physiology, diagnosis, and pharmacology. You can picture them carefully examining patients, discussing symptoms, and then preparing remedies. This is where things get particularly fascinating, as it's a prime example of knowledge transfer and local adaptation. A quirky and rather wonderful tidbit is the detailed recording in some Timbuktu manuscripts of the medicinal uses of specific local plants. These texts describe how various roots, leaves, barks, and berries were to be prepared as infusions, poultices, powders, or salves to treat a wide range of ailments, from fevers and digestive issues to skin conditions and even broken bones. Some of these traditional remedies, based on plants unique to the Sahel region, are now being rediscovered and studied by modern pharmacologists, who are finding that these ancient healers often had a very good understanding of the active compounds in their local flora. Some of those old salves and potions might sound a bit alarming to us today. A poultice of what exactly? Mixed with crocodile dung and hope? But hey, if it helped your boils to stop, well, boiling or soothed a persistent cough, you probably wouldn't have complained too much about the ingredient list. Of course, the depth and breadth of original scientific inquiry versus the faithful transmission of older knowledge is a classic point of discussion. Historians of science still argue whether the scientific knowledge evident in the Timbuktu manuscripts was primarily preservative, meticulously copying and accurately transmitting the established Greco-Arabic and wider Islamic scientific traditions, or if there's clear evidence of significant local innovation, empirical experimentation, and original observational discoveries, particularly in fields like botany, pharmacology, or even unique astronomical observations specific to their southern latitude. Were they mainly curators of ancient wisdom or active contributors making new breakthroughs? It was likely a dynamic interplay of both. It's important to remember that these sciences were generally not seen as disciplines entirely separate from religion. Rather, studying the natural world, the stars, the human body, or the logic of numbers was often considered a way to better understand and appreciate God's magnificent creation, or as tools to help fulfill religious obligations more perfectly. Astronomy served prayer, mathematics served religious law and commerce, and medicine served the community's well-being, a collective responsibility. So, as you drift, picture Timbuktu not just as a city of theologians and jurists, but also as a place where scholars peered at the stars through simple sighting tubes, where they calculated complex fractions to ensure justice in inheritance, and where they gathered herbs from the sparse desert landscape to create soothing salves. The intellectual life was rich and multifaceted, reflecting a deep curiosity about both the divine and the created world. That fascinating blend of divine understanding, celestial observation, mathematical precision, and healing arts we just explored shows just how multifaceted the pursuit of knowledge was in Timbuktu. But the intellectual curiosity of its scholars didn't stop there. The human experience itself, our emotions, our stories, our place in the sweep of time, and how we should conduct ourselves, also found its expression in precious, handwritten manuscripts. So, let's now leaf through the pages that speak of verse, of chronicles, of distant lands, and the very art of living well. Beyond the weighty tomes of law and theology, and the intricate charts of astronomers, the libraries of Timbuktu also resonated with the rhythms of poetry. The mainstream historical fact to gently embrace here is that Timbuktu's manuscript collections held a significant body of literary works, especially poetry. This included classical Arabic poetry from the great masters of the Islamic East, but also, importantly, original compositions by local West African poets. Imagine open mic night in medieval Timbuktu. Instead of angsty teens with poorly tuned guitars, you'd have distinguished scholars, perhaps with a cup of sweet mint tea, dropping profound verses about the beauty of the desert night, the fleeting nature of existence, praises for the prophet, elegies for departed friends, or even surprisingly witty social commentary. Probably less craft beer involved, though, and more intense appreciation for elegant turns of phrase. These poems weren't just light entertainment. They were a sophisticated art form, a way of expressing deep truths and emotions, and a vehicle for preserving cultural memory. Then there were the chronicles, the histories, or tarikhs. These are some of the most valuable treasures to have survived, offering us a glimpse into West African history from an indigenous perspective, rather than solely through the eyes of outside observers. Two of the most famous are the Tariq al-Sudan, History of the Sudan, referring to the land of black peoples, by Abd al-Rahman al-Sudi, and the Tariq al-Fatish, Chronicle of the Researcher, attributed to Mahmud Kadi and his descendants. These aren't dry lists of dates and kings, though they certainly contain much of that. They are rich narratives, weaving together accounts of dynastic struggles, the rise and fall of empires like Mali and Songhai, the lives of important scholars and saints, descriptions of cities, and even accounts of significant events like droughts or plagues. Writing history back then was a serious, painstaking commitment. No Wikipedia to quickly double-check a date or the spelling of a ruler's name. Just your own meticulous notes, perhaps interviews with very old, knowledgeable individuals who remembered stories passed down, and a profound hope that you spelled everyone's ridiculously long and distinguished name correctly for posterity. These chronicles give us invaluable insights into the political and social world of medieval West Africa. Of course, like all historical writing, they come with their own perspectives and potential biases. Literary historians still argue whether the Timbuktu chronicles, such as the Tariq al-Sudan, should be read primarily as objective, factual historical records in the modern empirical sense, or more as carefully constructed narratives that blend verifiable fact with legend, oral tradition, and socio-political commentary, perhaps intended to legitimize certain ruling lineages or promote particular scholarly viewpoints. Understanding these nuances is key to appreciating their true depth. Beyond their own lands, Timbuktu scholars were also interested in the wider world, leading to the study and creation of geographical works. These might include descriptions of trade routes, the characteristics of different peoples and lands, and observations about natural resources. Sometimes these were based on classical sources like Ptolemy, as transmitted through Arabic scholars, but they also incorporated the first-hand knowledge of merchants and travelers who had ventured far and wide. You can imagine a scholar eagerly debriefing a camel caravan leader who had just returned from a perilous journey to a distant oasis or a northern city, meticulously recording details about the journey, the customs of the people encountered, and the goods available. It was intelligence gathering, academic research, and sheer curiosity all rolled into one. And what about the art of living well? Manuscripts on ethics, akhlaq, and good governance were also present. These texts would explore virtues like honesty, justice, generosity, and humility, often drawing on both Islamic teachings and universal philosophical principles. Advice to rulers on how to govern justly and maintain the well-being of their subjects was a common theme, reflecting the close relationship that often existed between the scholarly class and the ruling elite. These weren't just abstract ideals. They were practical guides for navigating the complexities of human relationships and societal responsibilities. A really interesting and quirky tidbit related to the literary culture is the use of Ajami scripts. While formal scholarship was conducted in Arabic, some manuscripts feature local African languages, such as Songhai, Fulfulde, or Hausa, written using a modified Arabic alphabet. This Ajami script might appear in the margins as glosses or explanations of Arabic texts, or sometimes entire original works, like poems or religious instructions, were composed directly in a local language using these adapted letters. It's a fascinating example of linguistic innovation and cultural fusion, like when people today type their own language using a different script or character set on social media. A clever workaround that probably confused the heck out of anyone not in the know, but perfectly sensible and incredibly useful to the local community, allowing broader access to written ideas. So, the intellectual landscape of Timbuktu, as reflected in its manuscripts, was remarkably diverse. It wasn't just about law and prayer. It was about capturing the sweep of history, the beauty of verse, the understanding of distant lands, and the pursuit of a virtuous life. These folios reveal a deep appreciation for the breadth of human thought and artistic expression, creating a rich cultural tapestry that complemented and enriched the city's profound religious scholarship. The secrets of the libraries weren't just one kind of knowledge, but a whole spectrum. That rich tapestry of poetry, history, and ethical thought we just glimpsed, woven alongside the more structured religious and scientific disciplines, gives us a sense of the sheer intellectual breadth of Timbuktu. But what was it actually like to live that life of learning? To be a student thirsting for knowledge, or a master dedicated to imparting it, amidst the unique conditions of this Saharan city? Let's try to imagine a typical day, your own personal scholar's daily scroll, unfolding amidst the pervasive dust, the stimulating debate, and the quiet thrill of discovery. The day for both student and scholar in Timbuktu would begin long before the sun had fully asserted its fiery dominance over the desert landscape. The first call to far prayer, echoing from the minarets of Jingareber, Sankor, or Sidi Yehya, would stir the city from its slumber. No rolling over and idly checking your phone for notifications for these dedicated individuals. It was straight out of your sleeping mat, performing ablutions with carefully conserved water, and heading to the mosque or joining household prayers. This pre-dawn period, cool and still, was often considered prime time for memorization or quiet reflection on texts studied the previous day. You can almost feel that hushed, expectant energy. After prayers, a simple breakfast might follow, perhaps some millet porridge, dates, or bread, washed down with water or milk if available. Their study snacks throughout the day probably weren't bags of greasy chips and sugary energy drinks, more like another handful of dates, some dried fruit, and perhaps a deep philosophical conundrum to chew on alongside them. Keeps the mind sharp and the grocery bill low, I suppose. For the student, the morning would likely involve attending a teaching circle or halqa with their chosen master. You'd make your way through the narrow, sandy lanes of Timbuktu, the sun already beginning to climb, the city slowly coming alive with the sounds of traders setting up their stalls and artisans beginning their work. You might gather with a small group of fellow students in a shaded mosque courtyard, the cool earthen walls a welcome relief, or perhaps in the master's own home. The mainstream historical fact to absorb as you settle into this imagined scene is that the daily life of scholars and students in Timbuktu revolved around the Islamic prayer schedule, with learning activities such as memorization, lectures, debates, and the painstaking copying of texts taking place in various settings, from these mosque courtyards and dedicated schools to the private homes of the scholars, often fostering very close and enduring master-disciple relationships. The master, having also completed his morning prayers and personal study, would begin his teaching. This might involve dictating from a classic text, pausing to offer detailed explanations, posing questions to gauge understanding, and encouraging discussion. You, as the student, would be listening intently, your wooden board law and read pen, kalam, at the ready to take notes or practice your calligraphy by copying passages. The air would be thick with concentration, the master's voice a steady rhythm against the distant sounds of the city. Debate was a cornerstone of the learning process. It wasn't about acrimonious argument, but about rigorously testing ideas, exploring different interpretations, and honing one's own understanding. Imagine theological or legal debates so intense, so intellectually agile, they made modern online comment sections look like a rather dull and impolite tea party. But here it was face-to-face with profound points being made, and a deep respect, usually, for opposing viewpoints, all in the pursuit of deeper truth. A quirky and significant tidbit is the immense value placed on this oral skill. A scholar's reputation and influence might depend as much on their eloquence, their quick wit, and their ability to persuasively defend a position in public argument as on their published written works or the number of books in their library. As the midday heat intensified, there would be a pause for the dur prayer, perhaps followed by a modest lunch and a period of rest or personal study. The city would likely feel quieter then, a gentle siesta settling over it as people sought refuge from the harshest rays of the sun. This might be a time for you, as a student, to work on copying a manuscript borrowed from your master or a wealthier patron, the careful scratching of your pen a meditative act. Or perhaps you'd review your notes, preparing for the afternoon session. The master, too, might use this time for his own research and writing, composing new commentaries, legal opinions, or poetry. His home would be a hub of intellectual activity, perhaps with other scholars visiting to discuss complex issues or to consult his library. Hospitality was a key virtue, and traveling scholars would often be welcomed and supported by their Timbuktu counterparts. The afternoon would bring more study with the ASR prayer, possibly another teaching session, or perhaps a more public lecture or debate at one of the major mosques. And how were all these aspiring scholars, especially those from poorer backgrounds or distant lands, supported? Social historians still argue whether the financial support for students and less affluent scholars came primarily from established charitable endowments, WACs, associated with the mosques, which were common in other parts of the Islamic world, from the personal generosity of wealthy merchant patrons and the master scholars themselves, who might take students into their own households, or if many students had to engage in part-time trade, craft work, or copying services to sustain their often miger existence. As evening approached with the Maghrib prayer at sunset, and later the Isha prayer, the pace might slow. Perhaps there would be more informal discussions, storytelling, or the recitation of poetry under the emerging stars. The desert air would cool, bringing a sense of peace. For you, the scholar or student, it would be a time to reflect on the day's learning, the discoveries made, the questions pondered before taking your rest, ready to repeat the cycle, the daily unrolling of your personal scroll of knowledge the next day. It was a life of discipline, devotion, and an unquenchable thirst for understanding, lived out amidst the dust and the timeless wisdom of Timbuktu. That daily rhythm of prayer, study, and debate we just imagined, the constant hum of intellectual life in Timbuktu, was all fueled by the knowledge contained within those precious manuscripts. Our journey tonight is framed around unearthing the lost libraries and finding out what secrets were found. So, as you continue to drift comfortably, let's pause and ponder what we really mean by secrets in this context. Are we talking about ancient conspiracy theories, maps to forgotten gold mines, or perhaps the medieval Timbuktu equivalent of a classified government document detailing the migratory patterns of unusually intelligent desert foxes? Probably not the latter, though that would be a fun read. When we speak of the secrets of Timbuktu's libraries, it's less about a single earth-shattering revelation hidden in a booby-trapped vault, and more about a vast universe of knowledge that was, for centuries, largely secret in the sense of being unknown, inaccessible, or underappreciated by much of the wider world, particularly the Western world. The primary mainstream historical fact to gently consider here is that the secrets or lost knowledge of Timbuktu's manuscripts largely refer to this incredibly rich body of Islamic scholarship covering theology, law, history, and the sciences, including unique West African historical chronicles and local adaptations in fields like medicine or astronomy, which existed and flourished independently, and was for a long time obscured from global view by geography and historical circumstance. So, one layer of these secrets is simply the rediscovery of practical knowledge that had been refined and recorded there. Imagine detailed astronomical observations made from a Saharan vantage point, offering unique data, or mathematical treatises with elegant solutions to complex problems of inheritance or commerce, perhaps employing methods that differed from those developing elsewhere. Think of those medical texts we touched upon, filled with local ethnobotanical wisdom and knowledge of plants and their properties that could cure ailments, knowledge that was passed down and meticulously recorded. Finding a manuscript detailing a forgotten but effective treatment for a common illness, based on readily available local resources? That's a pretty valuable secret to unearth. Perhaps there were even texts on sustainable agriculture in arid lands, or innovative building techniques perfectly suited to the climate. This isn't fantastical, but rather the accumulated wisdom of a society deeply attuned to its environment. Imagine if they had a manuscript detailing how to get perfect Wi-Fi reception in the middle of the Sahara using only sand and a determined camel. Now that would be a secret worth unearthing. Probably not in there, but a sleepy historian can dream, can't we? Then there's another layer, which might lean more towards what some would consider esoteric or hidden wisdom. Timbuktu was a significant center for Sufism, the mystical dimension of Islam. Sufi masters often explored the inner spiritual path, direct experiences of the divine, and complex metaphysical ideas. Their writings might delve into symbolic interpretations of the Quran, the nature of the soul, and practices for spiritual development. These texts weren't necessarily secret in the sense of being forbidden, but their understanding often required a certain level of spiritual maturity or guidance from a teacher, making them less accessible to the uninitiated. Alongside this profound mysticism, you might also find manuscripts touching on subjects that we today might categorize differently. For instance, a quirky and fascinating tidbit is the presence of texts on ilm al-ramal, the science of sand divination or geomancy, dream interpretation, the creation of talismans for protection or healing, or even aspects of numerology, ilm al-huruf, the science of letters and their numerical values. Some of these texts, dealing with the spiritual properties of certain geometric shapes, or the precise timing for specific actions based on astrological calculations, might sound a bit out there to our modern, scientifically oriented ears, perhaps like your wonderfully eccentric great-aunt enthusiastically explaining her extensive crystal collection and its vibrational energies. But for many scholars of that era, these were considered legitimate branches of knowledge, ways of understanding hidden patterns and influences in the universe, often deeply intertwined with their understanding of theology and the natural world. This leads to an interesting point of discussion for contemporary researchers. Researchers and philosophers still argue whether the term secrets, when applied to Timbuktu's manuscripts, should primarily imply deliberately concealed esoteric doctrines, a kind of hidden knowledge passed down only to a select group of initiates, or if it more accurately reflects knowledge that was lost to wider global circulation due to historical events, geographical isolation, and linguistic barriers, thereby becoming secret only in the sense of being rediscoverable by a new audience. It's a subtle but important distinction. Was it knowledge actively hidden by its creators, or knowledge simply hidden from us by the passage of time and the shifting sands of history? Perhaps the most profound secret of Timbuktu's libraries isn't a specific fact or a forgotten spell, but the sheer existence and resilience of such a vibrant, diverse, and sophisticated intellectual tradition in what many outsiders long considered to be an impossibly remote and desolate corner of the world. The dedication to learning, the meticulous preservation of texts through centuries of upheaval, the fusion of Islamic scholarship with African perspectives, that is a powerful revelation in itself. It challenges long-held assumptions about where knowledge resided and who its custodians were. The secret is that a city built of mud at the edge of a vast desert held a universe of thought, a universe we are still only beginning to fully explore and appreciate. Each manuscript opened is a conversation resumed, a voice from the past given a chance to speak again, sharing insights that are sometimes practical, sometimes profoundly spiritual, and often simply deeply human. That vibrant, resilient intellectual tradition we've been so gently exploring, that universe of thought housed in Timbuktu's libraries, was, like all beautiful and complex things, tragically fragile when faced with the brute force of political ambition and military might. For centuries, Timbuktu had thrived, a beacon of learning at the edge of the Sahara. But as the 16th century drew to a close, a storm was gathering far to the north, a storm that would irrevocably tarnish this golden age. You can almost feel a chill wind beginning to blow across those warm desert sands, carrying with it the scent of gunpowder and impending upheaval. The setting is the late 1500s. The once mighty Songhai Empire, under whose dominion Timbuktu had reached its zenith, was facing internal stresses. But the decisive blow came from outside, from the Saadian Sultanate of Morocco, under the ambitious Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur. Al-Mansur, whose own epithet was al-Dahabi, the Golden One, had his eyes firmly fixed on the legendary gold sources of West Africa, and he believed that controlling the Songhai Empire, and specifically its lucrative trans-Saharan trade routes, was the key. The Moroccans weren't really there on a library exchange program, let's put it that way. They were far more interested in the gold part of gold and scholarship, and the scholarship, along with the scholars themselves, rather inconveniently got in the way of their new, rather aggressive management style. So, in 1590, al-Mansur dispatched a formidable military expedition south across the Sahara. And here's a rather quirky tidbit about this invading force. Its commander, Juder Pasha, was a eunuch of Spanish origin, reportedly captured as a child and raised in the Moroccan court. His army wasn't just Moroccan. It was a hardened, professional force of several thousand men, including many European renegades and Moriscos, Muslims of Spanish descent who had been expelled from Spain, and crucially, they were armed with arquebus, early firearms, and cannons. So, the guy leading this epoch-changing invasion was essentially an HR department of one, recruiting from all over Europe and North Africa, and not exactly checking for strong interpersonal skills or a desire for peaceful cultural exchange on the application forms. The Songhai army, though numerically superior and fighting on home turf, relied mainly on cavalry and traditional weapons like spears and swords. The inevitable clash came in 1591 at the Battle of Tondabai, not far from the Songhai capital of Gao. The mainstream historical fact to gently settle into your awareness now is that this Moroccan Saadian invasion of the Songhai Empire culminating in the devastating defeat of the Songhai forces at Tondabai, largely due to the shocking effectiveness of Moroccan firearms, marked a decisive and tragic turning point. It led to the swift collapse of the vast Songhai Empire and heralded the decline of Timbuktu as a major political, economic, and intellectual powerhouse. The Songhai warriors, brave as they undoubtedly were, essentially brought spears, arrows, and incredible courage to a cannon and musket fight. It's a bit like showing up to a Formula One race on a really well-trained, very enthusiastic donkey. Admirable and points for spirit, but the technological disparity in weaponry made the outcome somewhat predictable and utterly heartbreaking for the Songhai. After Tondabai, the path to Songhai's major cities, including Timbuktu, lay open. When Judar Pasha and his forces entered Timbuktu, it was not as liberators or enlightened guests. They came as conquerors. The city was occupied, its wealth plundered, and heavy tribute demanded. But perhaps most devastating for the legacy we've been exploring was the impact on Timbuktu's scholarly community. The invaders, wary of the influence and potential resistance from the city's learned elite, moved to suppress them. Scholars were seen as community leaders, figures of authority, and potential rallying points for opposition. Many of Timbuktu's leading intellectuals, including the renowned jurist and writer Ahmed Baba el-Masifai, were arrested. Ahmed Baba, whose personal library was said to contain over 1,600 volumes, a staggering number for a private collection at the time, was forcibly exiled to Marrakesh along with other prominent scholars. He famously lamented the loss of his books more than his own freedom, a sentiment that speaks volumes about the values of that scholarly culture. While some scholars were eventually allowed to return, many perished in exile, were executed, or simply scattered, their teaching circles disrupted, their students dispersed. The vibrant intellectual ecosystem was brutally shaken. This invasion didn't just harm the people. It fractured the very foundations that allowed Timbuktu's scholarship to flourish. The trans-Saharan trade routes, already facing competition from new European maritime routes along the African coast, became less secure and more chaotic under the often unstable Moroccan rule, known as the Arma period. The wealth that had supported scholars, funded libraries, and attracted students began to dry up. The delicate peace and order necessary for deep intellectual pursuit were replaced by uncertainty and often harsh military governance. Now, was this the sole cause of Timbuktu's decline? Historians still argue whether the waning of Timbuktu's intellectual golden age was an immediate and direct consequence of the 1591 invasion alone, or if internal Songhai political weaknesses, environmental challenges like drought, and those slowly shifting trans-Saharan trade patterns were already contributing to a more gradual decline that the invasion merely accelerated catastrophically. It's likely a complex interplay, but there's no denying that 1591 was a body blow from which Timbuktu's scholarly preeminence never fully recovered to its former glory. The golden age was tarnished, not overnight perhaps, but the luster began to fade significantly. The systematic patronage of scholarship dwindled. The grand mosques, though still standing, saw fewer students in their courtyards. The bustling book trade slowed. It's a somber note in our journey, this realization that such a brilliant center of learning could be so grievously wounded. Yet, as we'll see, the story doesn't end here. For even in these darkening times, the commitment to preserving those precious manuscripts, those secrets of Timbuktu, took on a new, desperate urgency. That somber note of Timbuktu's golden age being tarnished, the echoes of invasion and the scattering of its scholarly light, might lead you to think that all was lost, that the precious manuscripts, the repositories of centuries of wisdom, simply crumbled to dust or were carted off wholesale. But if that were the case, our sleepy journey tonight would be a much shorter and far sadder affair. No, the story takes a turn here, a testament to the deep, enduring reverence for knowledge that had become woven into the very fabric of Timbuktu's families. You can almost feel a quiet, determined resolve settling in the air, a commitment to protect what was truly valuable. Even as Timbuktu's political and economic star waned, and the grand public support for scholarship diminished, the flame of learning didn't just flicker out. It was carefully, lovingly, and often secretly tended within the walls of private homes, by generations of guardians of parchment. These weren't necessarily famous scholars in the public eye anymore. but ordinary families, descendants of those great jurists, astronomers, poets, and historians, who understood the immense worth of the books they had inherited. Imagine your family's most precious heirloom isn't grandma's slightly alarming porcelain doll collection, or a chipped teacup from a forgotten monarch, but a heavy, leather-bound trunk or several, filled with fragile, 14th century astronomical charts, theological treatises, or unique historical chronicles, which you occasionally have to bury in the backyard or conceal within a wall when political winds shifted dangerously. Makes for a rather interesting and deeply significant family dynamic, doesn't it? The primary mainstream historical fact to gently cradle in your thoughts now is that following the 1591 Moroccan invasion and throughout the subsequent centuries of instability, which included periods of Tuareg rule, Fulani jihads, French colonialism, and general regional conflicts, many Timbuktu families took truly extraordinary measures to preserve their ancestral manuscript collections. They hid them in their homes, sometimes in specially constructed hidden rooms or niches within the thick mud brick walls. They buried them in sealed chests or clay jars beneath the cool desert sand, hoping to retrieve them when times were safer. They packed them into leather satchels and camel hair bags, ready to be spirited away at a moment's notice. These manuscripts became treasured, almost sacred, family heirlooms, passed down from father to son, mother to daughter, along with the solemn duty to protect them. These weren't just casual spring cleaning situations where you might accidentally toss out an old, dusty book. This was often operation. Save centuries of accumulated human wisdom from utter obliteration, probably executed with fewer cool spy gadgets and a lot more fervent prayer that the termites, the damp, or an invading army didn't stumble upon your meticulously chosen hiding spot. You can almost picture a family elder, late at night, by the flickering light of an oil lamp, carefully wrapping a precious volume in cloth, perhaps whispering a prayer over it before consigning it to its temporary tomb, and trusting its future to the sands and to God. The ingenuity involved was remarkable. A quirky and rather telling tidbit about these preservation efforts involves stories of manuscripts being disguised or hidden amongst less obviously valuable household goods to avoid detection by looters or suspicious authorities. Perhaps a stack of priceless legal commentaries might be placed at the bottom of a grain storage jar, covered with millet, or a collection of poetry slipped between woven mats. There are also accounts of families developing specific traditions and even rituals associated with the handling, reading, or storage of their particular collections, further emphasizing the revered, almost talismanic status these books held, even when their contents couldn't be openly studied or shared as freely as in Timbuktu's heyday. For these families, the manuscripts weren't just old books. They were tangible links to their ancestors, like having your incredibly wise, slightly dusty great-great-grandparents living in a trunk, ready to offer advice and share their stories, provided you could still read their elegant, but perhaps fading, handwriting. Of course, conflict wasn't the only enemy. Preservationists and historians still argue whether the most significant long-term threat to the Timbuktu manuscripts over these intervening centuries was the outright destruction and looting during periods of political instability, or the slower, more insidious and constant damage caused by environmental factors. Imagine the challenges. The extreme desert climate with its fluctuating humidity, surprisingly damp at times near the river, then bone dry, the ever-present threat of insects like termites and silverfish which find parchment and paper to be a delightful snack, the abrasive sand that could infiltrate any crevice, and the simple passage of time wearing away at ink and bindings, especially for texts not stored in ideal, climate-controlled conditions, which, let's be honest, were non-existent. Keeping these fragile items safe was a constant battle against nature itself. Yet, despite all these formidable challenges, invasions, civil unrest, colonial disruption, the quiet ravages of time and climate, an astonishing number of manuscripts survived. This survival is a direct tribute to the unwavering dedication of these ordinary Timbuktu families. They became the unsung librarians, the secret archivists, the true guardians of this immense intellectual heritage. They may not have always had the resources for sophisticated conservation, but they had something more powerful: a profound understanding of the value of these texts and a deep sense of responsibility to future generations. It was an act of cultural resilience, a quiet defiance against the forces that sought to erase or diminish their history. And it is thanks to these dedicated guardians that our journey to unearth Timbuktu's secrets is even possible today. as we begin to see how these hidden treasures started, ever so slowly, to come back into the light. Those incredible, centuries-long efforts by Timbuktu's families, those quiet guardians of parchment keeping their ancestral libraries safe through thick and thin, largely unfolded away from the gaze of the wider world. But the legend of Timbuktu, a potent mix of gold, mystery, and whispered scholarly renown, still flickered in the European imagination. As the 19th century dawned, this flickering ember of curiosity, fanned by the winds of exploration and imperial ambition, began to glow brighter. You can almost sense a new kind of anticipation, a different sort of journey beginning, as determined, perhaps slightly sunburnt, figures started to dream of reaching this elusive prize. For centuries after the Moroccan invasion, Timbuktu had remained largely off-limits and incredibly difficult to access for Europeans. It was the forbidden city of the Sahara, its mystique only growing with its inaccessibility. But the allure of being the first European to reach it, to solve its geographical riddles, and perhaps to confirm or debunk the tales of its fabulous wealth, was a powerful magnet. Various geographical societies in Europe even offered substantial prizes for this feat, adding a competitive, almost sporting element to the endeavor. Some of these explorers probably expected Timbuktu streets to be paved with gold bricks and the libraries to have diamond-encrusted bookshelves. They found a lot of sand, a city bearing the scars of time and turmoil, and some truly remarkable books, which is arguably much better for us tonight, but perhaps initially less shiny for those dreaming of immediate riches. The mainstream historical fact to gently tuck away now is that during the 19th century, a number of determined European explorers, including figures like the British Major Alexander Gordon Laing, the Frenchman René Cayley, and the German scholar Heinrich Barth, undertook incredibly perilous journeys across the Sahara to reach Timbuktu. Their motivations were a complex cocktail: genuine geographical curiosity, a thirst for adventure, scientific inquiry, national pride, and, increasingly, the gathering of information that would prove useful for burgeoning colonial interests. Major Laing, for instance, reached Timbuktu in 1826, becoming one of the very first Europeans to do so. Unfortunately, his triumph was short-lived. He was tragically murdered just a few days after leaving the city, and his detailed notes were largely lost. Then there was René Cayley, a truly resourceful character. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. Cayley, learning from Laing's fate and understanding the dangers, spent years immersing himself in Arab culture and Islamic customs. He then undertook his journey in disguise, traveling as an Egyptian Arab named Abdallahai, and reached Timbuktu in 1828. Imagine spending months, even years, learning just enough Arabic and local etiquette to hopefully not get immediately outed as a Frenchman probably longing for a decent croissant, all for a Geographical Society prize and the glory of discovery. Talk about commitment to the bit. Cayley managed to stay in the city for about 2 weeks and, unlike Laing, made it back to Europe alive to tell the tale, though his descriptions of a somewhat dilapidated Timbuktu were, for some, a little underwhelming compared to the glittering legends. He did, however, note the presence of many books and the importance of Islamic learning. Perhaps the most significant of these early European visitors, at least in terms of appreciating the scholarly heritage, was Heinrich Barth. A German scholar in British service, Barth undertook a massive expedition across the Sahara and the Sahel region between 1850 and 1855. He spent a considerable amount of time in Timbuktu and, unlike some of his predecessors who were perhaps more focused on just reaching the city, Barth, with his academic background, recognized the profound intellectual culture that had existed and, to some extent, still lingered there. He meticulously documented what he saw, learned some local languages, and made inquiries about the city's history and its manuscripts. He understood that the true wealth of Timbuktu wasn't just about gold, but about these very texts. However, these early encounters were often fleeting or superficial when it came to the manuscripts themselves. The explorers faced immense difficulties: the brutal climate, disease, political instability, suspicion from locals, often quite justified, given the later colonial context, and the sheer logistical nightmare of trans-Saharan travel. Access to private family libraries wasn't easily granted to dusty, exhausted foreigners who might not fully grasp the cultural or religious significance of what they were seeing, or whose motives might be suspect. It's like they stumbled upon a treasure chest, but instead of pirate gold, It was full of incredibly complex theological arguments and centuries of legal debate in a language most of them barely understood. Yes, very book-like and quite old. They might have jotted in their field notes, perhaps before asking if anyone knew where the alleged gold-paved streets were. This brings us to a point of ongoing and often sharp discussion. Historians and post-colonial scholars still argue whether the primary motivation of these 19th-century European explorers in seeking out Timbuktu and other remote parts of Africa was genuine scientific and geographical curiosity, a pure pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, or if their endeavors were more intrinsically, and perhaps sometimes unconsciously, linked to the vanguard of colonial expansion, gathering intelligence, mapping territories, and ultimately demystifying and asserting a kind of conceptual dominance over these regions. It's rarely a simple either/, or, of course, human motivations are usually a muddle. Regardless of the complex web of motivations, the reports of these explorers, particularly Barth's detailed accounts, began to bring the existence of Timbuktu's manuscript heritage to broader international attention in a more concrete way than ever before. The elusive prize wasn't just the physical city anymore, but the tantalizing prospect of the knowledge hidden within its ancient texts. These early, often fumbling interactions laid the groundwork, for better or worse, for future engagement with these invaluable documents, an engagement that would eventually see more focused efforts to study, preserve, and understand the true depth of Timbuktu's scholarly legacy. The Guardians had kept the secrets safe. Now the outside world was beginning, slowly and imperfectly, to knock on the door. That tentative knocking on Timbuktu's door by those early, often sun-dazed European explorers in the 19th century, while sometimes fumbling and driven by a mixed bag of motives, did succeed in one crucial thing. It began to alert the wider academic world to the incredible, largely untapped ocean of manuscripts still held within the city and its surrounding regions. As we drift into the 20th century, you can sense a shift in the approach. The era of the lone, swashbuckling explorer gradually gives way to more systematic, sometimes institutional efforts to locate, understand, and, crucially, safeguard these fragile, scattered documents. The great text hunt was beginning in earnest. The 20th century saw a slight change in tactics, you could say. Less charge bravely across the desert with a pith helmet and a very vague map hoping for the best, and more arrive with a slightly more reliable Land Rover, some acid-free archival boxes, and a very polite, carefully worded request to perhaps see your esteemed grandfather's potentially priceless 500-year-old library. Progress of sorts, though still fraught with its own complexities. During the French colonial period, which encompassed Mali, then known as French Sudan, for much of the first half of the 20th century, official French institutions began to take a more organized interest. The mainstream historical fact to gently file away here is that during this colonial era, and then with renewed vigor after Mali gained its independence in 1960, more methodical efforts were initiated to survey, collect, and sometimes, quite controversially, acquire Timbuktu's manuscripts. Institutions like the Institut Français d'Afrique Noire (IFAN), later becoming the Institut Fondamental d'Afrique Noire, played a significant role in early research and collection, aiming to centralize some of these texts for study and preservation, as they saw it. These efforts weren't always straightforward, nor were they universally welcomed. Imagine being a family in Timbuktu who had, for generations, faithfully guarded your ancestral manuscripts through thick and thin, hiding them from invaders, protecting them from the elements. Then, along comes a colonial administrator or a foreign researcher, however well-intentioned they might profess to be, suggesting that these deeply personal and sacred heirlooms would be safer or better studied in a centralized, perhaps distant archive. Trying to convince a family of this probably involved more delicate negotiation, more patient explanation, and more shared cups of sweet mint tea than your average United Nations peace treaty. And even then, success was far from guaranteed. There was, quite understandably, a deep-seated mistrust of official efforts to gather these texts, particularly during the colonial period when the power dynamics were so unequal. Yet, there were also local scholars and intellectuals who recognized the immense value of these texts for their own national heritage and for global scholarship, and who worked tirelessly, often with very limited resources, to preserve them. A quirky and truly vital tidbit from this era is the story of individuals like Mama Haidara, a Timbuktu notable and scholar who, long before any major international projects, meticulously maintained and expanded his own family's vast library, one of the most famous in Timbuktu. He understood the importance of not just owning the books, but of cataloging them, repairing them, and making them available in his own way for study. Figures like him became crucial bridges, respected within their own communities and eventually recognized by the wider scholarly world as key custodians and experts. The challenges these 20th century text hunters faced were immense. The manuscripts weren't neatly stacked in a central public library waiting to be cataloged. They were dispersed among countless families, hidden away in trunks, in wall cavities, in back rooms. Many were in fragile condition, damaged by time, insects, humidity, or the very sand that defined their environment. It was a painstaking process of building trust, of patient inquiry, of following rumors and leads. Sometimes a significant cache might be discovered when an old house was being renovated, or when a family facing economic hardship might reluctantly offer some texts for sale or for copying. This period of intensified collection, especially during colonial times, leads to an ongoing and important discussion. Archivists, historians, and cultural heritage specialists still argue whether the colonial-era efforts to collect and centralize manuscripts, while sometimes undoubtedly preserving them from immediate physical danger or neglect, were also acts of cultural appropriation that decontextualized the texts by removing them from the families and communities that had been their guardians for so long. Or were they, given the lack of local resources for professional conservation at that specific time and the very real risks the manuscripts faced, necessary, if imperfect, interventions? It's a debate with no easy answers, touching on complex issues of ownership, access, and the legacy of colonialism. Despite the complexities and the ethical considerations, these 20th century efforts, by both foreign researchers and increasingly by Malians themselves, were crucial. They began to reveal the sheer scale of Timbuktu's manuscript heritage. Not just a few hundred texts, but tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands, scattered throughout the region. It was like realizing that what you thought was a small, forgotten pond was actually the tip of a vast, submerged continent of knowledge. This growing awareness highlighted the urgent need for more concerted, better resourced, and locally led initiatives for preservation and study. The race against time and the elements, those termites of doom, the encroaching damp, the fading ink was on, and the librarians and local scholars were the often unsung, slightly less action-packed, but equally heroic protagonists in this unfolding drama. Their work laid the essential groundwork for the more formal institutions that would soon take up the mantle of safeguarding this incredible legacy. Those painstaking, often heroic, efforts by individuals and families throughout the 20th century to locate and safeguard Timbuktu's scattered manuscripts laid a vital foundation. But as the sheer scale of this textual treasure began to be more fully appreciated, it became clear that a more coordinated, sustainable, and professionally equipped approach was desperately needed. The torch, carried so faithfully by private hands for so long, needed a modern bastion to help protect its flame. And so, rising from the ancient sands, a new institution would emerge, dedicated to this very cause, a place named in honor of one of Timbuktu's most celebrated scholarly sons. You can almost picture the discussions, the planning, the dawning realization that these thousands upon thousands of fragile documents, holding centuries of wisdom, required more than just loving care in family trunks or back rooms if they were to survive for future generations and be accessible to the wider world. This brings us to the establishment of the Ahmed Baba Institute, or, to give it its more formal Sunday name, the Institut de Hautes Études et de Recherches Islamiques Ahmed Baba. Naming it after Ahmed Baba el-Massifi, that prolific 17th century scholar who, as you might recall, was exiled by the Moroccans and famously lamented the loss of his vast personal library of over 1,600 volumes, was a pretty clear statement of intent. We are serious about books here, folks. Very, very serious about preserving and studying them. The mainstream historical fact to gently nestle into your understanding now is that the Ahmed Baba Institute was officially established in Timbuktu in 1973, with crucial support from the Malian government and international partners like UNESCO. Its core mission was and remains to find, collect, preserve, catalog, study, and ultimately make accessible the Islamic manuscripts not just of Timbuktu itself, but from all over the surrounding regions of Mali. It was a monumental undertaking, a recognition that this heritage belonged not just to individual families, but to Mali and indeed to the world. Imagine the early days of the Institute. Its staff, often Malian scholars and librarians, faced the colossal task of convincing families, who had guarded their precious manuscripts through generations of upheaval, to entrust these heirlooms to a new, government-backed institution. Convincing families to part with, or even just allow access to and copying of, manuscripts they'd protected for centuries, sometimes at great personal risk. That probably required more charm, diplomacy, and patient explanation than a squirrel trying to get a particularly well-defended nut from a very cautious elephant. A quirky and rather telling tidbit about its early collection process is that it wasn't usually about confiscation. It often involved delicate negotiations, sometimes offering families financial compensation, promises of professional conservation, or the assurance that copies would be made and the originals perhaps returned or held on deposit. It was about building trust, demonstrating that the Institute shared their reverence for these texts. Once manuscripts began to arrive, the real work of a modern archival institution kicked in. This wasn't just about storage. It was about active conservation. Many of the texts were in perilous condition: brittle paper, eaten by insects, damaged by moisture or sand, with bindings falling apart. The Institute, especially with later funding and new facilities, aimed to provide what these texts desperately needed: climate-controlled rooms to combat the harsh Saharan environment, laboratories for cleaning and repairing damaged pages, techniques for deacidification to halt further decay, and skilled conservators to painstakingly piece together fragments. It's like taking your incredibly ancient, fragile great-great-grandparent from a beloved but rather dusty old armchair in a drafty room and carefully transferring them into a state-of-the-art, climate-controlled archival spa. A bit of a change of scenery, certainly, but so much better for their long-term health, and hopefully, they'd get a lot more appreciative academic visitors. Alongside physical conservation came the equally vital tasks of cataloging and digitization. Imagine having tens of thousands of unique, handwritten documents, each one needing to be carefully described, its author, title, subject matter, and approximate date identified. This meticulous cataloging is what transforms a pile of old books into a usable research library. And increasingly, in more recent decades, digitization, creating high-quality scanned images of the manuscripts, became crucial, both for preservation, reducing the need to handle fragile originals, and for making these texts accessible to scholars around the globe who might never be able to travel to Timbuktu. Of course, the role of such a centralized institution in a landscape of historically private, family-held collections sparks ongoing discussion. Cultural heritage managers and scholars still argue whether the long-term ideal for Timbuktu's manuscripts should be maximum centralization within well-funded institutions like the Ahmed Baba Institute to ensure professional conservation standards and wider scholarly access, or if more resources should also be directed towards supporting decentralized, family-based collections and local conservation initiatives, thereby keeping the texts within their original community contexts and empowering local custodians. It's a complex debate with valid points on both sides, seeking a balance between professional preservation and community heritage. The Ahmed Baba Institute, despite facing its own challenges over the years, including fluctuating funding, the sheer scale of the task, political instability, as we'll soon see, and the need for continuous training of specialized staff, stands as a vital modern bastion for this ancient knowledge. It's a symbol of Mali's commitment to its extraordinary intellectual patrimony, a place where the wisdom of centuries is carefully tended, studied, and prepared for future generations. It's where the whispers from those lost libraries are given a modern voice, amplified by research, and shared with a world eager to listen and learn from Timbuktu's enduring legacy. The text hunt had found a home, a dedicated headquarters in the ongoing mission to understand and protect these invaluable chronicles of human thought. The Ahmed Baba Institute, that modern bastion we just visited in our minds, along with the countless private family libraries, represented a determined effort to safeguard Timbuktu's precious literary heritage for the future. But even in the 21st century, the age of digital information and global interconnectedness, these ancient treasures would face a peril so acute, so direct, it would send shivers down the spine of anyone who valued history and culture. You can almost feel the calm desert air grow suddenly charged with tension, a sense of dread creeping in as the very survival of these manuscripts is thrown into jeopardy by a new kind of storm. The year is 2012. The political situation in Mali becomes dangerously unstable. A Tuareg rebellion in the north, seeking an independent state, creates a power vacuum. This is swiftly exploited by various Islamist extremist groups, including Ansar Dine and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb AQIM, who hijacked the rebellion and imposed their own harsh, intolerant ideology on the ancient cities of northern Mali, including our beloved Timbuktu. Their idea of cultural enrichment, as you might imagine, was somewhat different from the centuries of scholarly pursuit we've been exploring. It was less about appreciating 14th century astronomical charts or nuanced legal debates, and more about ensuring everyone adhered to their very narrow interpretation of religious law, which included a deep hostility towards many aspects of Timbuktu's rich Sufi traditions and its tangible heritage. The mainstream historical fact to absorb with a sense of foreboding is that in 2012, these extremist groups, after capturing Timbuktu, began a systematic campaign against cultural sites they deemed un-Islamic. They took pickaxes and bulldozers to the ancient Sufi mausoleums and shrines, reducing centuries of history and sacred architecture to rubble. For those watching, horrified, from around the world, and especially for the people of Timbuktu, the chilling question was, what about the manuscripts? Would these irreplaceable repositories of knowledge, these secrets of African scholarship, be next on the list for destruction? The fear was palpable. The Ahmed Baba Institute, with its tens of thousands of catalog texts, and the countless more still in private hands, were in grave danger. Some of the occupying militants initially tried to present a facade of respecting the manuscripts, perhaps not fully understanding their content or significance, or maybe just wanting to avoid immediate international outcry. But their broader actions, and the intolerant ideology they espoused, left little doubt that the texts were at extreme risk. These weren't just old papers to them. Many of the manuscripts contained ideas on philosophy, on diverse interpretations of Islam, on art, on science, that directly contradicted their rigid worldview. This is where the story takes a truly heroic, almost unbelievable turn. Faced with this imminent threat, a network of ordinary Malians, librarians, archivists, scholars, families who were the traditional guardians, and even local guides and boatmen, quietly, courageously, and at great personal risk, decided they would not let their heritage be erased. This wasn't some Hollywood heist with lasers, high-tech gadgets, and a team of impossibly cool international art thieves. This was Operation Save Priceless Heritage with donkeys, determination, diligence, and a whole lot of praying you don't hit a checkpoint run by particularly grumpy guys with guns and a penchant for smashing old things. Led by figures like Abdul Qadir Haidara, a Timbuktu librarian and manuscript curator who had been working for years to preserve these texts, a clandestine plan was hatched. The mission, to smuggle hundreds of thousands of manuscripts out of Timbuktu and other northern towns, right under the noses of the occupiers, and transport them over 600 miles south to the relative safety of Mali's capital, Bamako. A truly quirky and ingenious tidbit from this incredible rescue is the widespread use of ordinary metal or wooden footlockers, the kind you might use for household storage or travel. These inconspicuous chests were packed tightly with precious manuscripts, offering a decent level of protection and not immediately screaming priceless ancient documents inside to any curious militants at a checkpoint. For months, this secret evacuation continued. Manuscripts were carefully packed, loaded onto donkey carts, transported by small riverboats along the Niger, and then transferred to trucks and buses for the dangerous road journey south. Every step was fraught with peril. There were checkpoints, bandits, the risk of discovery by the extremists, and the ever-present danger of the manuscripts themselves being damaged in transit. People hid these trunks under tarpaulins, covered them with ordinary goods, or moved them in the dead of night. It was an act of mass cultural defiance, driven by a profound love for this heritage. You should never underestimate a librarian, especially one from Timbuktu. When faced with the potential for catastrophic cultural destruction, they don't just say SHHH. They orchestrate daring, large-scale manuscript evacuations that would make action heroes nod with respect. The success of this operation, which ultimately saved an estimated 350,000 manuscripts from potential destruction, is nothing short of miraculous. It's a testament to the bravery, ingenuity, and deep cultural pride of the Malian people. Of course, the situation on the ground was complex. Cultural preservationists and conflict historians still argue whether the international community's initial response to the threat against Timbuktu's cultural heritage in 2012 was swift and effective enough, or if crucial early opportunities were missed to provide substantial support for preemptive safeguarding measures before the occupation fully solidified and the risks became so acute. When French and Malian forces eventually liberated Timbuktu in early 2013, the occupiers, in a final act of spite, did set fire to a portion of the newly constructed Ahmed Baba Institute building, burning some manuscripts that were still there, a heartbreaking loss. But the vast majority, thanks to those clandestine heroes, were already safe, hidden away in Bamako. The digital age danger had been met not primarily by digital countermeasures, but by old-fashioned courage, community spirit, and a deep, abiding connection to the wisdom of the past. The guardians of parchment had once again risen to the occasion, this time in a race against a very modern and brutal threat. That incredible, nail-biting rescue operation we just witnessed, the clandestine ferrying of hundreds of thousands of manuscripts from the brink of destruction in Timbuktu to the relative safety of Bamako, was a monumental act of cultural preservation. But once the dust settled, and a collective sigh of relief could finally be breathed, a new, equally monumental task began. What exactly had been saved? And what further secrets, what deeper insights, could this rescued wisdom now reveal to a waiting world? You can almost feel the hushed anticipation in those makeshift archives in Bamako, the gentle rustle of ancient paper as scholars and conservators began the painstaking process of unpacking and assessing these treasures. Imagine those scenes in Bamako, rooms, perhaps not initially designed as archival storage, suddenly filled wall-to-wall with those unassuming metal footlockers and wooden chests we heard about. Each one opened would reveal another cache of handwritten history, another bundle of human thought carefully wrapped and preserved by generations past. The sheer volume was staggering, right? You can almost hear an archivist sigh, partly in exhaustion, partly in awe. Another 1,000 unique treatises on 14th century Maliki contract law to sort through. And oh look, tucked in here is a rather lovely, previously unknown poem about a very determined desert goat. The sheer variety is just astounding. The mainstream historical fact that emerged with even greater clarity from the study of these rescued collections is the truly astonishing breadth of subjects covered by West African scholars over centuries. It wasn't just a confirmation. It was an emphatic underlining of Timbuktu's intellectual richness. Yes, Islamic theology, Quranic exegesis, and Maliki jurisprudence formed a massive foundational core, as we've explored. But alongside these were extensive, sophisticated works on astronomy, including precise calculations for prayer times and calendars adapted to their specific latitude. Detailed mathematical texts dealing with everything from complex inheritance divisions to commercial transactions, and remarkably insightful medical treatises blending Greco-Arabic traditions with local African pharmacology. There were also, as we've touched upon, those invaluable historical chronicles, vibrant collections of poetry, geographical accounts, ethical discussions, works on logic, rhetoric, and even what we might call diplomacy or conflict resolution. This rescued wisdom powerfully challenges any lingering, simplistic narratives about pre-colonial Africa being somehow devoid of deep-written scholarship or advanced learning. Finding detailed astronomical calculations or sophisticated medical texts really does mess with that old, dusty, and frankly lazy narrative of nothing much happening in Africa before Europeans showed up. Turns out they were just a bit busy writing encyclopedias, running universities, and, engaging in centuries of profound intellectual discourse. One of the truly exciting aspects of having so many texts gathered together, even in exile, was the opportunity for new discoveries and connections. A quirky and delightful tidbit for you is the frequent discovery, within these rescued collections, of unique local commentaries on well-known classical Arabic or Islamic texts. This showed that Timbuktu scholars weren't just passively receiving and copying existing knowledge from elsewhere. They were actively engaging with it, critiquing it, expanding upon it, and adapting it to their own cultural and intellectual context. You might find a famous philosophical work by Al-Farabi or Avicenna, and tucked within its pages, or as a separate accompanying volume, a detailed commentary by a Timbuktu scholar, offering a fresh West African perspective. Sometimes, handwritten notes in the margins of a manuscript, perhaps by a long-forgotten student or scholar, offer incredibly human glimpses into their lives, their questions, or contemporary events. You half expect to find a medieval shopping list tucked into a serious philosophical text. Need more ink, some good quality dates, pick up that copy of Al-Ghazali from Sheikh Ibrahim, and remember to argue with him about the true nature of the soul afterwards. It just makes them feel so much more real and connected to us. The initial insights gleaned from these recovered texts reinforce the understanding of Timbuktu and its sister cities as vibrant hubs in a transcontinental network of learning. The manuscripts revealed correspondence between scholars across vast distances, evidence of texts being imported, copied, and debated far from their places of origin. They highlighted the cosmopolitan nature of this intellectual world. Of course, the work didn't stop with the unpacking. Each manuscript needed careful assessment for damage, followed by meticulous conservation where possible. Then came the immense task of cataloging and the ongoing push for digitization to ensure both preservation and wider access. And this brings us to a contemporary point of thoughtful discussion. Academics, librarians, and cultural heritage specialists still argue whether the primary focus for these rescued manuscripts, now that many are relatively safe, should be on rapid, large-scale digitization to ensure their survival against any future threats and to facilitate broad global access for international research collaborations, or if more initial emphasis and resources should be directed towards in-depth study, translation, and interpretation by Malian scholars and institutions first. This latter approach would aim to ensure local ownership and understanding of this critical heritage, allowing Malian voices to lead the narrative before wider dissemination. It's a delicate balance between urgent preservation, global access, and local intellectual stewardship. The rescued wisdom revealed by these texts is not a closed chapter. It's an ever-unfolding story. Each manuscript studied, translated, or digitized adds another piece to the vast, intricate puzzle of West African intellectual history. It's a powerful reminder that knowledge can be incredibly resilient, capable of surviving centuries of turmoil, if only there are dedicated guardians willing to protect it. The initial insights have been breathtaking, confirming the depth and diversity of thought that flourished at the edge of the Sahara, and promising many more revelations yet to come as this precious cargo of knowledge continues to be explored. That breathtaking moment of discovery, as hundreds of thousands of manuscripts were unpacked and assessed in Bamako, revealing the vast scope of Timbuktu's intellectual heritage, was just the beginning of a new, complex chapter. The immediate physical danger might have receded for many of these texts, but a whole host of ongoing debates, dilemmas, and profound responsibilities emerged, questions that scholars, librarians, cultural heritage professionals, and the Malian people themselves continue to grapple with. You can almost feel the air in those archives, thick not just with the scent of old paper, but with the weight of these important considerations for the future. The mainstream historical fact that grounds our sleepy contemplation here is that the rescued Timbuktu manuscripts, while now largely safe from the immediate threat of the 2012 conflict, continue to face significant ongoing challenges. These relate to their crucial long-term conservation, as many are still housed in Bamako in conditions that may not be ideal for centuries-old parchment and paper. The immense and continuous need for highly skilled conservators, archivists, and translators, the critical issue of securing sustainable international and local funding for this colossal undertaking, and navigating the incredibly complex, often sensitive questions of intellectual property, digital access rights, and rightful custodianship between the traditional family owners, national institutions, and the global scholarly community. One of the first big dilemmas is interpretation. Now that more of these texts are accessible, at least to researchers whose voice, whose perspective, should guide our understanding of them. How do we ensure that the interpretation of this profoundly African and Islamic heritage isn't inadvertently filtered through a predominantly Western or neocolonial lens? There's a growing consensus on the absolute necessity of Malian scholars and African intellectuals taking the lead in interpreting and contextualizing these texts, bringing their unique linguistic skills, cultural understanding, and historical insights to the forefront. It's about ensuring the narrative remains rooted in its origins. Then there's the monumental task of translation. Many of these manuscripts are written in dense, scholarly Arabic, often with regional linguistic quirks, specialized terminology, and deep poetic or philosophical allusions. Translating a 15th century theological debate on the subtle nuances of divine will from classical Arabic, especially when it's filled with obscure literary references and terms that lack a simple modern equivalent, is less like straightforward translation and more like highly advanced linguistic archaeology, possibly performed while simultaneously juggling invisible flaming torches and trying to explain it all to a skeptical audience. No pressure at all. It requires not just exceptional language skills, but also a profound understanding of the historical, cultural, and intellectual milieu in which these texts were created. Finding and funding enough skilled translators for such a vast corpus is a generational challenge. A fascinating and quirky tidbit here is the sheer layered complexity within the language itself. A single word or phrase might resonate with Quranic verses, lines of pre-Islamic poetry, specific legal precedents, and local proverbs all at once, making a truly full translation an incredibly rich, but also an incredibly demanding endeavor. Access is another hot topic, a real head-scratcher. In an ideal world, everyone who wants to study these texts should be able to. Digitization offers a seemingly magical solution. Scan the manuscripts, put them online, and boom, global access. And indeed, many important digitization projects are underway, which is fantastic for preservation and for reaching researchers worldwide. However, it also brings up questions about the digital divide. Who has reliable internet access and the necessary technology to use these digital archives effectively? There are also concerns about intellectual property, copyright, even for ancient texts. The rights of the families or institutions holding them are a consideration, and the potential for misuse or misinterpretation if texts are just thrown online without sufficient context or scholarly apparatus. Deciding who gets to see what, when, and how, while balancing openness with responsible stewardship, is the academic and archival equivalent of trying to decide who gets the last, most delicious piece of cake at a very large and opinionated family gathering. Everyone has a strong viewpoint, and you really don't want to start a food fight or, in this case, an international incident over a PDF. And what about the physical manuscripts themselves? The debate we touched on earlier continues. The international community of scholars, Malian heritage professionals, and traditional custodians continue to grapple with complex questions regarding the most ethical and effective long-term strategies for the interpretation, dissemination, and stewardship of Timbuktu's vast manuscript legacy. Is the best approach to centralize as many as possible in state-of-the-art facilities like the Ahmed Baba Institute for Professional Conservation? Or should more support flow to decentralized collections, helping families preserve their own heritage in situ, maintaining that deep local connection? Many families, after all, still hold significant private collections and remain wary of depositing them with any institution, preferring their centuries-old tradition of guardianship. There's no one-size-fits-all answer. Finally, there's the relentless issue of long-term preservation for these incredibly fragile survivors. Ensuring these texts survive another 500 years involves far more than just hoping the termites take a permanent vacation to a less literate region. It requires sustained funding for conservation materials and expertise, ongoing training for Malian heritage professionals, stable political conditions, and even considering the impacts of climate change on storage environments. Whether in Timbuktu or Bamako, it's a marathon, not a sprint, and it needs commitment from Mali and the international community alike. So, as you drift, understand that the story of Timbuktu's manuscripts is not just one of past glory or dramatic rescue, but also one of present-day challenges and profound responsibilities. The secrets they continue to reveal are not just about the past, but also about how we, today, choose to value, protect, and understand this extraordinary inheritance of global importance. The debates are lively, the dilemmas are real, but the shared goal is to ensure these voices from the sands of time continue to speak to us all. As our journey through the sands of time and the stories of Timbuktu's invaluable manuscripts draws towards its close for tonight, you can hopefully feel the profound weight and the enduring resonance of this extraordinary legacy. We've navigated through bustling marketplaces of gold and salt, witnessed the rise of majestic university mosques, delved into the intricate daily lives of scholars, pondered the very meaning of secrets, faced the turmoil of invasion and the quiet heroism of preservation, and considered the complex challenges that still surround these ancient texts. What remains, settling gently like the finest desert dust in our minds, are the echoes in the dust, Timbuktu's lasting importance as a vibrant symbol of Africa's rich intellectual past and the continuous, exciting unearthing of its wisdom. The mainstream historical fact that serves as a capstone to our sleepy exploration is this. The vast corpus of Timbuktu manuscripts collectively represents one of the most significant and undeniable proofs of a sophisticated, deeply literate, and profoundly scholarly pre-colonial civilization in sub-Saharan Africa. This evidence fundamentally challenges and continues to dismantle older, often Eurocentric and deeply flawed, narratives about the continent's history and its remarkable intellectual contributions to the global tapestry of human thought. For a long time, the official history book for some parts of the world basically had a chapter on Africa titled Mostly Sand, a few interesting animals, and not much else to see here, folks. The Timbuktu manuscripts are very polite but incredibly emphatic. Ahem, excuse me, we were just over here on the other side of the Sahara, building universities, writing encyclopedias, debating philosophy, and composing rather excellent poetry, if you don't mind. Timbuktu's intellectual legacy is like that really catchy, beautiful song you can't quite get out of your head. But instead of a fleeting pop jingle, it's centuries upon centuries of profound scholarship, ethical reflection, and artistic expression. And thankfully, it's so much more edifying and has much better liner notes. The unearthing isn't just a one-time event. It's a continuous process. A quirky and truly hopeful tidbit is the fact that even today, new, previously unknown private manuscript collections are still occasionally discovered or made known by families in the Timbuktu region and beyond. It suggests that the full extent of this incredible literary and scholarly heritage may still not be completely mapped or understood. It's like the world's most intellectually satisfying archaeological dig, but instead of pottery shards or old tools, you might find a perfectly preserved argument about the ethics of governance, or a forgotten historical chronicle that sheds new light on an entire dynasty. Well, maybe not time travel ethics, but equally cool and historically significant stuff. This ongoing discovery also fuels contemporary discussions about the nature of the knowledge itself. Contemporary African philosophers and historians still argue whether the vast intellectual traditions preserved in the Timbuktu manuscripts represent a wholly distinct African philosophy or indigenous mode of thought that developed in unique ways, or if they are best understood primarily as a significant regional expression and expansion of the broader Islamic scholarly tradition, albeit with undeniable local inflections, innovations, and a focus on African contexts. It's a rich debate that highlights the complexity of cultural and intellectual exchange. The echoes from Timbuktu's dusty manuscripts resonate in many ways today. They inform contemporary Islamic scholarship, provide crucial data for historians of Africa, and inspire artists, writers, and thinkers across the globe. They remind us that centers of learning can emerge in the most unexpected of places, and that the pursuit of knowledge is a universal human endeavor. They also carry profound lessons about the resilience of culture in the face of adversity, and the sacred duty, passed down through generations, to preserve wisdom even when the world around seems to be falling apart. The story of these manuscripts, their creation, their near destruction, their heroic salvation, and their ongoing study, is a powerful narrative of human dedication to ideas. It's a testament to the belief that what is written, what is learned, and what is understood holds a value that can transcend empires, outlast conflicts, and speak to us centuries later, offering insights, challenges, and a deeper connection to our shared human story. The dust of Timbuktu may seem ancient, but the echoes of the voices captured within its manuscripts are remarkably and wonderfully alive. And so, as the echoes of Timbuktu scholars and their precious, resilient manuscripts begin to soften and recede into the quiet stillness of your mind, allow yourself to feel a deep sense of peace, a sense of connection to that distant, remarkable place. The journey we've taken tonight, across vast deserts and through the corridors of time, has shown us the enduring power of human curiosity, the profound beauty of dedicated learning, and the incredible courage of those who safeguard wisdom against the encroaching shadows. The vibrant city of learning, with its earthen mosques reaching towards a star-dusted Saharan sky, now fades gently into the backdrop of your thoughts. The faint rustle of ancient parchment, the quiet murmur of scholarly debate, the determined scratch of a reed pen by lamplight, All these sounds blend into a soothing hum, a lullaby from a world both ancient and ever relevant. You can let go of the details now, the names, the dates, the intricate arguments, and simply rest in the knowledge that such a place of profound intellectual light truly existed, and that its legacy continues to enrich our understanding of the world. There are no more challenges to ponder tonight, no more debates to unravel, only the gentle reassurance that knowledge, like the desert wind, finds its way, and that stories of human endeavor and the pursuit of understanding are a timeless comfort. Allow the last images to dissolve, like a mirage at dusk, leaving behind only a sense of calm and quiet wonder. You are safe, you are comfortable, and the wisdom of the ages, like a soft blanket, enfolds you. Sleep now, sleep deeply, and carry the quiet wonder into your dreams.